Racist cop attacks. Black woman in court without knowing. She's his new police chief. He walked into the courtroom, confident badge on his chest, bias in his eyes. To him, she was just another black woman who didn't know her place. He interrupted her. He mocked her. He even shoved her. And the whole room froze. Because no one dared to say what they all knew, she was his boss. Not just any boss. His new police chief, hand-picked, highly decorated, and just appointed the day before. He didn't recognize her because racism rarely looks up. What happened next didn't just shake the courtroom. It shook an entire city's idea of justice, rank, and respect. Stay with us, because this isn't just about one man's mistake. It's about what happens when power meets prejudice and gets exposed. You think this is a damn circus? Get up! Get out now! Rick Holston barked like a guard dog of power that had just caught the scent of black skin in the courtroom. The black woman sat still. No words, no movement. But to him, her skin was a one-way pass to hell, and her silence was a confession. No name asked, no ID checked. He ripped her from the seat like a dirty rag off the marble floor. Seconds later, the entire courtroom froze, like someone had cut the power. The judge stood, voice crashing through the room like a gavel smashing privilege to pieces. You just assaulted the new chief of police, Dr. Anne Hathaway. He thought he was taking out the trash. Turns out he just threw his entire career into the fire and she was the one holding the match. Charleston, 8:12 a.m. Courtroom No. 3 was packed. The ceiling fans spun lazily as if even the air itself was holding its breath. No one spoke above a whisper. Every murmur was swallowed by the old brick walls. Under the pale glare of fluorescent lights, the tension was thick enough to make the scratch of a pen or the tap of a low heel echo like gunshots. Rick Holston stood by the entrance, arms crossed. His police uniform was ironed to a razor-sharp crease, buttons gleaming under the cold white light. He scanned the room like a prison guard counting inmates. Too many strangers. Too many eyes watching him like he was the problem. These people didn't know the rules, didn't know their place. His gaze landed on the front row. A black woman in a cream blouse and simple black slacks sat upright, hands folded neatly on her lap. No phone, no notebook, just staring straight at the bench like she knew every crack in the wall. No press badge, no name tag, not a familiar face, wrong posture, sitting like she owned the place. She wasn't from around here. Rick narrowed his eyes. He didn't like the way she sat silent but unbowed, as if watching and judging everything, as if she was the one running the room. In the row behind her, a few people exchanged glances. An old woman mumbled, "Isn't that?" Well, then trailed off as if she'd just remembered something, but no one followed up. The atmosphere was off, like something was lurking. Rick inhaled deeply. He rolled his neck, adjusted his belt, his hand brushing the gun on his hip without thinking. Don't start anything. I'm not here to play civil rights with idiots. A younger officer, Dawson, stepped up beside him and said quietly, "That woman, she's been sitting there the whole time. You know who she is." Rick didn't answer, just curled his lip. "I'll handle it." And he stepped forward. Rick Holston walked up to the front row, each step thawing against the tiled floor like nails sealing a coffin. The fluorescent lights above cast his shadow over the woman sitting there, as if even his shadow had the authority to command her to stand. She remained seated, back straight, motionless, legs crossed, with decorum eyes fixed on the bench. No expression, no reaction. It was that very calmness that drove Rick mad. "You think this is a damn circus?" he growled, each word sharp enough to cut through the tiers of seats. "Get up. Out now." Gasps echoed behind him. An older woman clutched her daughter's hand. A law student snapped her notebook shut. The tension gathered like a storm forming in a sealed room. Anne didn't move. She only tilted her head just slightly. Not in defiance, but as if she were listening to the fury bubbling beneath Rick's need to control. She didn't respond. She didn't have to. Rick froze for half a second. Something was off. A kind of silence that made him feel exposed like a predator realizing the prey is watching back. She wasn't afraid. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was waiting. But for what? He shot a quick glance at Officer Dawson, younger, less sure, and now staring at him with visible discomfort. "Hold up, Rick." "I think she quiet," Rick snapped. A drumbeat of tension pounded in his head. He didn't care who she was. He was the law. No one sat there without a badge, not a reporter, not court staff. And yet she sat like she was waiting for a medal to be pinned on her chest. He'd handled dozens like this before. Disruptors, illicit recorders, those amateur justice warriors showing up just to provoke the cops. The kind who cried victim and then raged on social media like they were competing in the Olympics of suffering. And now a black woman in neutral clothing, no credentials, sat front row right under his nose. Rick tightened his grip on his holster, though he had no intent to draw. That familiar contact hand near weapon was what steadied his ego. Behind him, a middle-aged man whispered, She looks familiar." A woman squinted, leaning in. "That couldn't be. No way." Rick heard it, and he hated that phrase, "no way." He didn't believe in coincidences, didn't believe in reason. He believed in control, in the authority of the uniform. A single glance that disrupted order was enough grounds for removal. He inhaled deeply, took another step forward. "Do you hear me? I am ordering you. Leave this courtroom or you will be forcibly removed." Anne turned her head slowly. Her eyes met his calm, unflinching, unafraid. Not pleading, just a silent truth. He was burying himself right in front of everyone. And Rick, so used to unchallenged commands, had no clue. The next moment would rewrite his entire legacy. He didn't wait. He reached out and grabbed Anne's arm with the force of someone used to dragging offenders from scenes. No warning, no signal, just raw impulse to assert dominance. The sudden jerk made Anne's body lurch forward like a tree pulled from its roots. Her heels slid slightly. A sharp gasp came from a girl in the third row. Then a scream tore through the air. "What the hell are you doing?" A white woman shot up from her seat. Eyes wide, heads turned, hands flew to mouths. Some reached for their phones out of reflex. One phone slipped from someone's grip, clattering against the tiles. Clack! The sound rang out like a gavel, slamming down a fateful verdict. Anne didn't resist, didn't pull back, didn't cry out. Her body bent forward for a moment, then steadied itself. Her small, blocky heels scraped the floor with a slow, steady grind. She wasn't panicking. She hadn't even broken eye contact with Rick. It wasn't anger in her gaze, nor helplessness, just a terrifying calm, as if she were watching a machine blindly executing its own destruction. Rick avoided her eyes. He gripped her wrist like an object to be removed. In his head, familiar phrases echoed. Non-compliant resisting authorized force, courtroom safety. The vocabulary he once used to justify orders, defend actions, and excuse excess. Officer Dawson stepped forward. "Rick, stop it. Let go." But Rick ignored him. His hand clamped down tighter as if his authority would vanish the moment he loosened it. In the back row, a young lawyer's fingers shook as she hit record. Her iPhone trembled in her grip. The screen blurry from unsteady hands. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. A police officer dragging a black woman out of a courtroom in broad daylight in front of a judge in front of cameras. And nobody moved. No one intervened. They were all too stunned to react. Anne still said nothing. With every step Rick took, her eyes stayed locked on his like a silent indictment being etched onto his face. Rick thought he had removed a threat, but he didn't realize. A few more steps and he'd crossed into no man's land, not because of Anne, but because he'd brought violence into the one place justice was supposed to live and believed it would stay silent. The air shattered like cracking glass, and at that moment a wave of whispers swept through the crowd. "Who is she?" A law student squinted, stammering, "No way. She looks familiar." Rick kept his power stance, but the silence behind him had changed. It was no longer submission. It was waiting for the fall, and this time no one would catch him. The judge's gavel slammed 3 times, echoing like hammer blows against the table of justice. Each strike was cleaved through arrogance, and each one was a death nail for the mask which was beginning to crack. Enough! Stop immediately! The words cut through the room like lightning through silence. Rick flinched, breath hitching his hand, still gripping Anne's wrist out of instinct, as if letting go meant admitting guilt, surrendering control. But his entire body was going cold, not from regret, but because something was wrong. Too many eyes were on him now, and none of them looked afraid. No more tolerance, no more silence, no more fear. The judge rose, his black robe rustling as he leaned forward. His voice was low, firm, and metallic. Officer Holston, you just used force on the highest-ranking official in the Charleston Police Department. The statement needed no emphasis, no repetition. Spoken once, it froze the air in the courtroom. Rick went rigid. His mind couldn't process the words. His eyes blinked rapidly as if hoping the nightmare would vanish if he just didn't look at it. He stammered. Who is she? I didn't. His mouth opened, but no sentence followed. The feeling was familiar, but this time he was the one being interrogated, the one out of place. An old man in the back whispered, "My God, it's her." A female law student nodded repeatedly, whispering to her seatmate, "I saw her photo on the news yesterday. The mayor announced it." Phones were rising across the room. Fingers were flying. Live streams went live. Messages were sent, and her identity spread like oil across water. The judge turned to the gallery, then back to Rick. His voice went razor-sharp. "Allow me to introduce Dr. Anne Hathaway, the newly appointed Chief of Police of Charleston." Officially sworn in by the mayor yesterday, the room exploded in a silent shockwave. Every reaction was sucked into one collective gasp. Rick let go, not out of principle, but because fear finally brushed the back of his neck. His hand released as if it had touched molten steel. Anne stood upright. She didn't dust herself off, didn't glance around for approval. She looked at Rick. One final look, firm without vengeance, but unforgettable. It was the look of someone who understood the fault wasn't just a man. It was the entire system that let him believe he was the law. Rick stood frozen, his face shifting shades red from fury, then pale from dread. The sound of camera shutters filled the air. Click, click, click. Like blades capturing a moment he could never erase. And right then, everything Rick believed was power, was control, was rank, shattered into dust. Boardroom was dead. Silence. No voices, no whispers. Even the wind whistling through the cracks seemed to freeze at the name just announced. Chief of Police, City of Charleston. For a moment as brief as a heartbeat, all sound, movement, and thought seemed to stop. No one moved. No one dared believe what they had just heard was real. That name didn't just halt Rick Holston in his tracks. It froze the entire room in a delayed realization. A realization that what they had just witnessed wasn't a routine act of maintaining order. It was a public, raw humiliation of justice. The stares that had once doubted her. The cautious glances at a black woman sitting in the front row without a badge or a guest pass now lowered in shame. Some looked down, others glanced around as if searching for someone else to blame. But no one dared be the first to break the crushing silence hanging over the room like a low ceiling. Rick was still standing, eyes wide, jaws slack. He didn't react, didn't know how to. He had always been the law in the eyes of his peers, the one who shouted and the crowd fell silent, the one who gave orders and people followed. But now all he had was an empty hand just released from the wrist of the woman he had no idea was his superior, the one with the authority to fire him on the spot. The one who had just toppled his entire protection network with nothing but her presence. No one stepped in for him. No one shielded him. The same colleagues who had clapped him on the back in the hallway that morning now avoided eye contact, afraid they'd be dragged into the pit he had just dug. A young officer at the back whispered, "Oh God, he's done." A female reporter clenched her recorder tight to her chest, trying to steady her breath, her mind looping just one headline. Police chief dragged out like a criminal by her own subordinate. Anne was different. She wasn't angry. She didn't question. She didn't claim victory. She didn't need to justify anything. She simply straightened her shirt sleeve, adjusted her collar like she had just stepped out of a strategic meeting. Every movement was calm, controlled, as if the world didn't require her reaction, but rather needed to reckon with its own behavior toward her. "This is the true face of this system, isn't it?" Anne said, eyes fixed on Rick. No mask, no explanation. It had just exposed itself on camera without anyone needing to push it. She turned. Her footsteps echoed across the tiled floor. Not fast, not slow, like a countdown ticking towards something big and real about to happen. Each step didn't just take her out of the courtroom. It dragged the entire Charleston Police Department into a confrontation with truth. With no escape, the crowd was still stunned. A few people began to raise their phones, trying to capture the moment, not of a black woman being dragged out, but of a police chief publicly disrespected, walking out with a presence that needed no validation. A law student near the wall whispered, "I've never seen anyone leave and make a room go still like that." Her friend nodded, whispering back, "Because she doesn't have to prove anything. The truth already did." As Anne passed the gallery, no one stopped her. No one dared meet her gaze. The same eyes that had judged her earlier. The furrowed brows at a black woman with no name tag, no guest pass, sitting proudly in the front row, now dropped like spilled ink pressed too hard into paper impossible to erase. No one dared lock eyes with her. No one wanted to play the one who knows the rules in a room where the rules had just been bent out of shape before their eye. She needed no security, no escort, no microphone to clarify or defend. Her silence had become the loudest sound in the room, one that hit each chest, directly making them feel exposed at the boundary between right and wrong. It made them realize for years they had stayed silent in the face of wrongdoing because they believed it didn't concern them. And now, one person without saying a single word made them feel more involved than ever. Rick, once proud to be the keeper of order, still hadn't moved. No commands left to shout. No one left to listen. He had once believed power came from the gun, the voice, the file. But now, as Anne walked out wordlessly, he finally understood. Real power comes from not needing to prove it, not needing to slam the table, threaten, or drag anyone out. Just being there was enough, and approached the door. Her pace was unchanged. Unhurried, undeterred. She stopped just once and turned back, not to look at Rick, but to look at the entire system trembling behind that worn wooden bench. From the judge, clerk, attorneys to the rows of officers who had once occupied safe ground, all now lay bare beneath her gaze. You all sat here, saw everything, and did nothing. Only when I was named chief of police did your eyes shift. But I saw enough, and I won't forget who stood where when it happened. No one heard those words because she didn't speak to them, but her stare carried enough weight to etch them into everyone's memory. Then she turned away, walked out of the courtroom. The light outside spilled across her back like a confirmation. Something had just changed for good. The door closed behind her with a soft click like a breath. Yet it thundered like a storm in the minds of those left behind. Only then did the crowd begin to breathe again. But the breath wasn't relief. It smelled of shame, of realizing they'd been silent for too long. A middle-aged man wiped sweat from his brow. An intern gripped her pen, unable to write. The young lawyer sobbed quietly, not from pain, but from something collapsing inside. The image of justice she once believed was unshakable. Rick still hadn't moved. His face drained of color. His shadow stretched across the floor, no longer able to hide the truth. He had picked the wrong fight, and worse, had represented a system that had just condemned itself with its own foolishness. Outside the courthouse, a few people had gathered. News had spread like lightning. A young woman rushed in breathless, asking someone, "Was it her, the new chief?" dragged out in the middle of court. A man shook his head, voice slow and deliberate. "No." She walked out on her own, head high. No one dared touch her. Online, the first videos were surfacing. The clip of Rick yanking her arm, shouting, "Get up out now!" Now thrown back in his face, captioned with trembling words, "This is how Charleston greets its new police chief." The first comments rolled in, and this time no one could delete them. Anne Hathaway walked out like any ordinary person, but the shock waves of her silence were spreading like a deep current beneath the city. A new storm was forming, and no one, not a single soul, could say they hadn't been warned. His name is Rick Holston, a veteran officer of the Charleston Police Department. 25 years on the force, his name appeared in every internal memo, always accompanied by phrases like handling high-risk situations, bravely subduing suspects, or preventing local unrest. His wall at home was lined with medals, each one another layer of polish on the portrait the old system tried to build. Rick, the silent, dedicated, decisive soldier. And behind that portrait was a whole department media machine where any crack could be quickly patched up with a news article, an award, or a quiet handshake behind the scenes. Rick was the type favored by the higher-ups, obedient, discreet, and more importantly, skilled at bending the truth when needed. He wasn't the impulsive kind. On the contrary, he was coldly calculating. He knew when to act and when to stay quiet. He understood exactly which lines he could cross without leaving a trace. He once told a rookie on the team, "Don't be stupid and clean up the whole mess. Just know where the cameras are and where they aren't." Everyone laughed at the time as if it were an inside joke, but they all knew Rick wasn't joking. He was trained in an era where tough was synonymous with authorized brutality. In internal training sessions, Rick consistently used more force than necessary when demonstrating restraint techniques. "They need to remember it," he once said while twisting the arm of a mock suspect until it turned purple. People laughed. No one objected because they had all come to accept one logic. As long as he made the arrest, it didn't matter how. Anyone who had worked with Rick knew he had a heavy hand. What did that mean? It meant punching a black teenager in the gut for being uncooperative. It meant pinning a knee into the neck of a handcuffed man, then writing in the report that the suspect resisted. It meant acting before there was evidence and then fabricating evidence afterward. But Rick's record was always clean. Every time a complaint was made about excessive force, it was handled internally. Always the same investigations so brief they defied belief. Testimonies that matched with uncanny precision. Inside the department, they called him the Wall. Not because he was strong, but because his shield was so thick that any accusation bounced right off. From 2013 to 2019, Rick served as the captain of the West Charleston Rapid Response Unit, an area known quietly as a hot zone, though no one dared say why. Internal statistics showed that the arrest rate of black youth in that zone was 3 times higher than elsewhere. Even though minorities made up only about 20% of the population in some years, Rick and his team handled over 100 cases in just 6 months. Most filed under vague charges like drug suspicion or resisting arrest. Flimsy accusations, but enough to justify detention. Anne had read those numbers in a federal report 3 years ago when she worked as a policy advisor for the Department of Justice. She remembered asking, "Why isn't anyone speaking out?" A black investigator looked at her with a half-smile, half-grimace, because his cover is bigger than City Hall. At the time, Anne didn't know Rick's name, but she had seen shadows like his in every city. Officers who thrived not because they were exceptional, but because the system had never wanted change. Rick's protector was the regional chief inspector at the time, a white man with a polished appearance, a friendly smile, and a tone that always sounded community-oriented. But beneath that image was a professional cleaner. He turned emergency calls into system errors, converted formal complaints into temporary storage files. Every time Rick got into trouble, he was the first to check on the situation. He's now retired, walked away with a spotless file and an untouched pension. But Rick is still here, and still thought he was untouchable until this morning when he grabbed the arm of someone he had no right to touch. When he tore his own mask off with his own hand, and all the medals, awards, and glowing press no longer held any weight compared to 3 simple words, just announced new police chief. But when the video of Rick Holston dragging the new chief out of the courtroom started circulating online, everything began to crack. It wasn't just a scandal. It was the first fissure in a wall built and maintained for over 2 decades. A wall once so thick it seemed impenetrable. But now, thanks to a less than 1-minute video, it began to crumble like old bricks, soaked by years of rain. And the first things to fall out were names, numbers, and case files long thought forgotten. Group of independent journalists who had repeatedly requested access to Rick's arrest records in incidents where suspects were injured, but no cameras were operating, came back. They weren't just suspicious now. They were furious. And this time they had public opinion behind them. They had video evidence. They had a police chief publicly assaulted, and no one could twist the truth. One by one, the names were revisited. One by one, the cases were reopened. Reports once buried deep in legacy systems rose to the surface like oil slicks from a rotting reservoir. The 2018 file, IDC 420997B, stood out first. A 17-year-old black teen, Malik T., had his collarbone broken by Rick during an on-site restraint. The report at the time claimed the suspect resisted and threatened officers with a sharp object. No video, no credible witnesses. Case closed in 4 days, with the conclusion insufficient grounds for disciplinary action. But this time a third witness, a medic who was on scene that day, finally stepped forward. He testified, "The kid didn't even get a word out before the man slammed him to the ground." I still remember the sound of bone hitting pavement. That statement, once excluded from the file for conflict of interest, was now entered as sworn testimony before the public. And who had signed off on closing that file back then? The same retired Inspector Rick's longtime shield. The questions began flooding in. Why always Rick? Why did injuries always coincide with his shifts? Why did cameras conveniently stop working during incidents labeled conflicts? A source within the department told reporters Rick had been the subject of at least 7 complaints over a 10-year span, all related to abuse of power, violence, or racial bias. None of those cases lasted more than 6 months. All stamped resolved internally. No one dared ask. No one dared reopen. Those who tried were transferred or buried in bureaucratic dead ends. Some left the force altogether disillusioned and bitter, until the woman Rick dragged out of court turned out to be the one with the power to reopen everything. Anne Hathaway isn't the kind of chief who shakes hands for cameras. She once served on federal task forces that dug up buried cases the system had long forgotten. She'd handled internal records from Chicago, Philadelphia, and a major abuse case in Ferguson. She knew how to unearth what had been buried under proper documentation and pre-written testimonies. And now Charleston, the city where her father had been shot dead by a police officer who mistook his gun, had given her authority. And Rick Holston, in his most foolish act yet, had just pulled the pin on that authority himself. The system that once protected him now had nothing to say because no defense could justify the image of him grabbing a woman in court later revealed to be his superior. No one wanted to stand by him. Not his colleagues, not his former commanders, not even the politicians who once treated him as their go-to enforcer. And Rick, for the first time in 25 years, had to face himself with no one left to shield him. Outside the station, the crowd grew. They weren't there to protest. They were there to wait to see this time who the system would choose to protect. And maybe for the first time in his life, Rick Holston finally understood what the suspects in his grip had long felt. The feeling of being seen, named, exposed. No violence needed. Just the truth. Anne Hathaway sat alone in her new office. Spacious, bright, but still bare. No old desk, no family photos, no familiar coffee mug slightly off to the left. The room was nearly empty, save for a swivel chair, a freshly cleaned metal desk, and tall glass windows letting in the light that spread across the stone floor. The air smelled of new paint tinged with dust from the hallway. Everything felt too new, too clean, as if no one had ever dared sit here long enough to leave a mark. She had taken the position less than 12 hours earlier. From the moment the judge announced the title chief of police of Charleston in the courtroom to the moment she stepped outside the courthouse into a heavy silence and hadn't had a second to breathe. The press exploded. Headlines screamed. But she didn't care about any of that. What kept her silent until now was something else. Something that had long simmered inside. The clash between victory and memory. She leaned her head gently against the back of the chair, eyes half closed. Outside the window, the city stirred, but in her mind was an old image. A stained brick wall, a corner store, and a 9-year-old child clutching a pillow, unable to understand why her father never came home. What happened that morning in court was historic, but also a reopened wound. At the very place where it all began, the eyes in that courtroom, both supportive and hostile, still clung to her like invisible dust. Some clapped, some live-streamed, some sneered through their noses. She saw it all but showed nothing because Anne knew they didn't see a chief of police. They saw a black woman sitting where she wasn't supposed to. That burden didn't kill her. It raised her. It taught her how to contain pain and turn it into the one thing no one could take from her resolve. Rick Holston wasn't the first to drag her out of a room she deserved to be in, and he wouldn't be the last to try and erase her from the list of voices that matter. But unlike when she was 9 this time, she had the power to return and take the front seat. Anne stood and walked toward the window. Charleston's low-rise buildings appeared quietly through the frosted glass. She saw her reflection faintly in the pane. Not clear, but enough to know the woman standing there was no longer the child crying beside an ambulance. Every step she took now carried the memory of a father who never came back. And that memory reminded her the office she now held wasn't meant for her to sit still in an old chair. It was meant for her to clear the room. From the ground up, a breeze slipped through the crack in the window, and turned, reached into her pocket and pulled out a black fountain pen. The one gift she always carried since getting into the Federal Security Academy. She placed it on the desk, then sat down for the first time that day, and wrote a single line on the first blank page of her term. No one gets to step on others to keep their seat, not even me. But Anne didn't need furniture to feel the change. She needed silence, not to rest, but to return to begin again from the place everything once broke and quietly rebuild it into a single promise. A hot afternoon 30 years ago, Charleston was still this city. But to her then it felt as vast as the universe and full of things no one would explain, and was 9 walking with her father to the corner store. It was a Sunday. Her mother was cooking dinner, and she had begged to tag along for an extra mint popsicle. She remembered clearly the way her father gripped her hand crossing the street. Gentle, but steady. "Always look both ways before you step," he'd say. Voice low and calm like a string instrument. Her father was a kind man who lived by one rule. Don't bother anyone, and don't let anyone bother your family. He worked as a security guard at the local library, didn't carry a gun, never picked fights. And that day, all he had was a small grocery bag and an old leather wallet, and stood outside the store licking the dripping popsicle when the gunshot rang out. A piercing bang that tore through the summer air like a slash through memory. A crowd gathered. Some screamed, some ran, some pulled out their phones, but she stood frozen, her tiny feet rooted to the ground. And then she saw him lying on the pavement, body tilted left, face turned toward her, one eye closed, the other barely open like it still wanted to speak. His crisp white shirt from that morning now soaked in red. So red, it no longer had a shape. They said he was wounded, but she knew because her mother had taught her when a shirt turns, that color people don't come back. The officer who fired stepped back, gun still raised. He kept repeating, "I thought he had a gun. I thought he had a gun." More police swarmed in. They threw up tarps, taped off the scene, cleaned up, but no one came to Anne. She stood there alone. No one asked her name. No one reached out until her mother ran up, eyes shattered in the wind, and only then did Anne cry. But not a child's cry. It was a soundless scream choked in her throat like a lemon squeezed tight but never breaking open. At the hearing, the officer testified the suspect behaved erratically. They said her father moved too fast. Someone claimed he looked like he was reaching for something. No one mentioned he was just pulling out his wallet to pay. The store camera had conveniently malfunctioned that day. And when her mother's lawyer pushed for an independent investigation, the court replied, "There's insufficient evidence of a crime." Anne never forgot the way her mother stood up from the courtroom bench, silent, taking her daughter's hand as they walked past rows of people who stared at them like they were the problem. No one offered comfort. No one asked, "Are you okay?" The adults that day were complicit through silence. They knew something was wrong but refused to claim their part in it. She remembered her mother's eyes not wet as people assumed, dry red, cold as stone. Her mother didn't scream, didn't slam her fists. She bent down, kissed Anne's forehead, and whispered, "You don't forget. You tell this story for me when I can't tell it anymore." From that day, Anne carried those words as her backbone. She didn't talk much, but she listened. She listened to every forgotten story, every case buried too fast, every gunshot that a report called accidental. And now, standing as the office of Charleston's chief of police, she understood one thing clearly. Her father didn't die because of a bullet. He died because of a system that didn't see him as human. And today she returned not for revenge, but to restore worth to people like him. Those who never got a voice once they fell. Back in the present, Anne rose from her chair, walking softly across the polished stone floor, still reflecting the dim light from the window. She walked slowly, not from fatigue, but to let each step leave its print on the room the way her years had imprinted on life itself. The room stayed quiet. No bells, no footsteps, only her breath, and the memories that hadn't yet fallen asleep. She stopped at the white painted wooden desk. The right drawer stuck slightly, needing a firm tug. Inside it was empty except for the one thing she brought with her today, a folded cloth wrapped in aging sandpaper. Anne peeled the paper, back her fingers touching the fabric with the care of someone holding something sacred. It was the chest piece of her father's shirt, the white shirt stained with blood outside that corner store 3 decades ago. Her mother kept it like a living sentence. Never washed, never cut, never altered, just folded, wrapped, and handed to her daughter the day Anne won a university scholarship. "Don't let them forget," her mother had said, voice softer than breath. "If anyone has the right to tell this story, it's you." Anne placed the piece of shirt into the drawer gently, deliberately, not to worship it, but to mark it as the place where justice began to reclaim its true form. She didn't cry, though her eyes stung, though her heart tightened at the memory of that unerasable stain. But Anne didn't need tears to prove she felt. She smiled, a smile that didn't burn, not hateful, not shaking, but sharp as a blade honed by time. That smile was the answer to every silent courtroom, every returned complaint, every glance that judged her as less just because they couldn't accept a black woman in the highest seat. That smile was also her weapon, her shield, her quiet flag planted in her life since age 9. And now, 3 decades later, finally raised where no one could take it down. She turned to the window. Outside was Charleston, the city that once taught her to endure, and now would have to relearn how to face itself. Tomorrow the press would scream again. Power groups would threaten. Rick's old allies would twist the story. But Anne knew one thing. The moment she walked into this room with the truth in her hand, no one could extinguish that light anymore. She returned to the desk, picked up the pen, and signed her first official act. Not a transfer order, not a press release, but a request to reopen all prematurely closed internal cases from the last 10 years. She named him directly, Holston Rick, and signed Hathaway and white paper, black ink, no slogans, no fluff. And that's how a 30-year-old promise was fulfilled. Not with gunfire, not with revenge, but with an authority no one could deny. Internal Operations Center, 3rd floor, Charleston Police Department. Cold white lights reflected off the large monitor where a stream of case numbers appeared one line at a time like unhealed wounds within the police force. Anne Hathaway stood with arms crossed, eyes fixed on the search display. Behind her were 3 members of the internal review team. Team lead DeMarcus technician Shannon and oversight attorney Carson. No one spoke. No one wanted to say a word as Rick Holston's name was typed into the search bar. Limit the query to the past 5 years. Han ordered, her voice even but cold as steel. Only showcases closed due to lack of evidence. Shannon tapped in more commands. A beep sounded. 5 case numbers appeared. Only one lit up red. EJ45. Beside it, a note. Black male, 16. Elijah Porter. Detained in West Charleston. Hospitalized same day for shoulder and head injuries. Final note slipped during restraint. No intentional action by officer. Anne said nothing, but her chest tightened. No attached video, no scene photos, no witness statements. The only file in the system was a single report from Rick Holston submitted via Supervisor Philip Raleigh on August 7th, 5 years ago. A case empty of evidence yet closed in just 3 days with a signature and the belief that no one would ever look again. Anne raised a hand. Zoom in on the signature. Shannon hesitated. It's an old scan, kind of blurry, but do it. The image enlarged. A slightly slanted signature. The P elongated and curling downward. A style that tried to look sharp, but came from someone who kept his hands in his pockets when questioned. At the bottom corner, the name, Philip Raleigh. DeMarcus raised an eyebrow. Raleigh was suspected of being tied to the internal slush fund. Remember? And nodded. I remember that case disappeared when he took early retirement for health reasons. Got a new house in Hilton Head a week later. Carson cut in. No one ever reopened it. The last person who tried got reassigned. That was before me. Anne replied, eyes still on the screen. No, it's not. Silence fell again. Shannon glanced at Anne, then said quietly, I might be able to restore the system logs from that day. If they weren't wiped, do it. But for now, I want every document tied to EJ45. Printouts, scans, internal memos, even network access logs for the 48 hours around the closure. DeMarcus exhaled. You know who you're messing with. Anne turned to him, eyes steady. No better than anyone. I'm dealing with a dead snake, but its mouth still has venom. Out in the hallway, the footsteps of passing staff grew faint. The room felt submerged under invisible pressure. No one wanted to speak next, afraid their words might end up in a report. Anne stared at the line. Elijah Porter, 16. She wondered. Where was he now? Was he still alive? Did he still remember the day his youth was shattered by a fall the system called unintentional? She saw her father's face behind every word. Elijah wasn't the first, but maybe he'd be the beginning of the end for a long string of lies. Shannon started printing. The machine whirred steadily like a quickening pulse. A report nearly 30 pages thick, but only 7 pages of content. The rest were appendices, repeated data filler to disguise the hollow S inside. That was how Rick had been protected. That was what Anne was about to tear apart. She picked up the file, gently brushing the corner like someone who'd read thousands of reports just like it, yet never seen one so devoid of the victim's voice. We can't let this go, she said softly. This isn't a case file. It's a murder license. No one dared sign with their real name. As the sun set, Anne remained in her office. Case EJ45 sat before her like a smudged ink painting. Details blurred, leaving only a sickening unease. She knew to find the truth, she had to dig deeper, and the first thing she needed was the system access log from the day the file was closed. She didn't assign it to internal affairs. They knew the system too well, and some may have looked the other way before. Instead, she called an independent technician from the Justice Department, a former collaborator from Atlanta named Marcus Delaney. His record included 2 overturned cases involving data manipulation. Most importantly, he once told Anne, "If a system looks too clean, someone probably scrubbed it too well." 3 hours later, Marcus arrived. His laptop opened. Data began flowing across the screen. He paused, typed deeper commands. "This is strange." He said the case was closed at 12:47 a.m., August 7th, but there's no login activity at that time. Not from the server, not from any terminal, nothing. Anne gripped the armrest. It couldn't have closed itself. Exactly. Marcus nodded. Worse, the log's been cut. Someone intervened. Very clean work. They knew exactly what they were doing. What about Rick? I checked his schedule. He was on leave that day. Marcus tilted his head. That means someone else built the file, and the only signature is Raleigh. That name surfaced like an old dagger, thought rusted now gleaming under surgical lights. Anne said nothing, but her stare was sharp enough to skin something pretending to be dead. She stood. I need to see someone, the only one who might have kept an offline copy. 40 minutes later, Anne knocked on a ground F floor or apartment door in North Charleston, the home of George Bellamy, former digital archivist for the department, retired 2 years ago. He opened the door, recognized Anne, flinched slightly, but stayed composed. I don't work there anymore, he said immediately. I'm not involved. I know, Anne replied. I'm not here to demand. I'm here because I hope you still kept a copy of file EJ45, the real one. George slowly shook his head. No file was ever allowed to be kept offline. True, but in 2021 you told a federal investigator that sometimes central data could be lost, so an unofficial backup was needed. George froze. His hand trembled slightly, but he held firm. I don't want trouble, and looked him in the eye. Neither do I, but I've had enough of silence. She reached into her coat pocket, took something out. Not a badge, not a file, but a piece of blood-stained shirt folded, preserved for 30 years, and laid it on the glass table in front of him. My father died in front of a corner store in 1995, she said quietly. I watched him lie there. The shooter was never tried. The report said the camera was broken, the case was closed. They told me to forget, but I kept this cloth for 30 years. A draft of justice left unfinished. I don't want another kid to hold something like this. George looked at the fabric. His old eyes welled up, not out of fear, but because he too had once kept something like that for himself. He turned away. Moments later, he returned with a faded hard drive. Here, a backup from the old server. Don't say I gave it to you. Anne nodded. I'll say I found it in the forgotten corners of a system that thought no one would come back. The file opened. The first line made Anne freeze. A handwritten statement by Elijah Porter dated August 6th. Messy handwriting, shaky but clear. I was pulled out the car, hit my head on the hood, no warning. I said, I don't got nothing, but he kept hitting. I remember sweat in his voice, yelling, Get down, punk! Then, nothing else. Man didn't blink. She folded the statement and placed it beside the shirt. A child beaten for no reason. A statement buried a cop on leave labeled on duty and a supervisor still unnamed in court. She stood. Nothing else needed to be said. Only one thought pounded in her head like a war drum. No one walks away this time. Elijah Porter, 16 years old. A senior at Roosevelt High School on a sports scholarship with no prior record. On June 12th, 5 years ago, he walked out of a grocery store with a bag of candy crossing through Charleston's west side, where black residents were often reminded, walk fast, don't talk, and if you're stopped, lower your head. But Elijah didn't lower his head. He walked like any other teenager. backpack slung over his shoulder, headphones on unhurried steps. Then a police cruiser pulled up without sirens. Rick Haston stepped out. According to what little was recorded, Rick asked Elijah to stop for a suspicious demeanor. Elijah asked why. Not rudely, just confused. But to Rick, any question from a young black man could be interpreted as a threat. Within 10 seconds, it escalated like a storm. Rick shoved Elijah into a wall, slammed his head on the hood, yelling repeatedly, "Down, you want a bullet, huh?" A nearby resident managed to record the first 18 seconds on a phone, but before any longer footage could be uploaded, the phone fell into a drain. At least that's what the witness later told police. Voice shaking, eyes lowered. Within 12 hours, an image of Elijah lying motionless with his head bandaged appeared on a local forum. The internet erupted. Community groups called for protests outside the Charleston Police Department. Day 1, 80 people. Day 2, 300. Day 3, nearly 600 stood under the sun holding banners demanding Rick Holston be prosecuted. But on the morning of Day 4, a statement from the department was released. Along with it, a 14-page report clearly stating the suspect exhibited resistance toward law enforcement, did not cooperate, and the officer was compelled to use necessary force. Internal investigation found no misconduct. The signature at the end, Chief Supervisor Philip Raleigh, and then like someone hit a mute button. Local media shifted tone. TV networks stopped replaying Elijah's footage. Newspapers referred to the incident as an unfortunate case and a consequence of non-cooperation. A social column even questioned, "Why are young black men so sensitive about being questioned?" The initial outrage dulled into exhaustion, and the system knew exhaustion is the most effective sedative to kill a rising anger. Inside the department, a few young officers showed signs of discomfort. One tried requesting dashcam footage, but the camera that day had a technical malfunction. Another accidentally mentioned in the cafeteria, "I heard Rick brag it was just some kid. He slammed into the ground to teach him a lesson." 2 weeks later, that officer was reassigned to a suburban district. No one brought it up again. Raleigh didn't need to threaten anyone. He was an unspoken boundary, a nameless shadow always looming behind every clean report and read through every piece of the so-called investigation. She rewatched a 5-year-old WCHR news segment, a white female anchor smiling as she announced, "Charleston police have completed their internal investigation, finding no misconduct by Officer Holston." That voice, that smile, became a blade in the memory of the community, as if truth had been sealed away in sugar-coated language. She looked at Elijah's profile photo eyes that hadn't yet figured out who he was before being crushed by a hand that had long claimed authority. Then Anne flipped back to the first page, underlined 3 words, "insufficient evidence." She closed her eyes briefly, not from fatigue, but from imagining the hand that signed that line. A hand that had silenced many. A hand that once tried to rewrite the law for an entire city. But now she held the pen. Anne walked into a community clinic tucked deep in Charleston's north side. No big signs, no fancy front desk, just the smell of antiseptic and the quiet of people too used to wounds that came without warning. In her hands, Elijah's handwritten statement and a blood-stained shirt. Evidence from 2 different victims. He came to find head nurse Marlene Porter, Elijah's mother, a petite, middle-aged woman, curly hair tied neatly behind. When Anne introduced herself, Marlene's eyes turned wary. "I'm not saying anything about that anymore," she cut in after the first sentence. "You think another statement can undo 5 years of silence?" And didn't answer. She opened her bag and placed 2 items on the wooden table. Elijah's handwritten account, the only version never submitted to court, and the blood-stained shirt of her own father. No persuasion, no pressure. No demand, just 2 suffocated memories waiting for a heart steady enough to face them again. The air in the room thickened. Marlene looked at the shirt, then at the jagged handwriting of her son. Her hands trembled as if touching that night once more. Then the memories surged back like a dammed flood released after too long. "I remember that night," she said softly, voice heavy. Elijah came home with his head wrapped, crying without sound. He didn't say anything, but I'm sorry. I wanted to press charges, but at 3:00 a.m., 2 officers came to our door, brought a paper non-litigation agreement, they called it, said if I signed it would be handled quietly. Wouldn't hurt his record. I signed like a fool and stayed silent. Simply listened, something no one had done 5 years ago. Marlene sat still for a moment, then wiped her tears and gripped the statement. He wrote everything, but no one read it. No one dared let that truth exist. And me, I let my son believe silence would make it all go away. After a long pause, she looked up, her eyes dry. If my son can't finish telling his story, I will tell it for him, even if I have to start from another courtroom. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't need to rise, but it carried more weight than any ruling Anne had ever heard from a judge's bench. Anne gave her hand a firm squeeze. No ceremony, no paperwork, but something had been awakened. Not trust, but the sheer will to survive from those who had once been crushed by the system. That day, Charleston heard nothing, but within it a voice had returned from the person who had once been the most silent. 3 years ago, Marcus Linwood joined the Charleston Police Department with fresh eyes and clean hands. He had just graduated from the academy, carrying a simple belief: protect the innocent, follow the law, and try not to upset the higher-ups. On his first day, it wasn't his new unit captain who shook his hand, but Rick Holston, who had just been commended for swiftly resolving 3 violent theft cases. Rick had a heavy gate boots that echoed hard against the hallway floor and a voice as steady as if he'd walked out of an ads cop film. To Marcus, he was one of those legendary names from the Academy Iron Discipline. Never backed down. The man who stood between order and chaos. In the 3rd week, Rick took Marcus on a night patrol in the West Side. Nothing unusual until they spotted a black teenager sitting on the curb opening a bag of Chip's earbuds in. Rick told Marcus to turn on the warning lights, not because there was any specific suspicion, just because the kid looked shifty. Marcus didn't question it. He just did it. When they stopped, Rick got out first. No greeting. He walked straight up, grabbed the teen by the collar and yanked him to his feet. "Name? What are you doing here?" the boy stammered. Before he could answer, Rick kicked his knee, sending him collapsing onto the steps, his head slamming against a store sign. Marcus stood less than 2 minutes away. He heard the impact, saw the boy clutching his head, saw a thin line of blood trickling down his collar. His first instinct was to step in, but Rick raised a hand. "Back off, he's resisting." Then he turned to Marcus and said, like a mentor offering career advice, "If you want to survive here, don't write anything that gets someone fired." Marcus froze. He didn't understand, didn't agree, but he stepped back. Back at the station, Rick wrote the report, claimed the suspect had slipped while trying to run. Marcus sat across from him, staring at the computer screen, fingers resting on the keyboard but not typing. He was asked to file a supplemental statement about the scene. In his mind, he saw the blood, the terrified eyes, but then Rick came over, patted him on the shoulder. "Don't ruin your career over some punk who'll be back on the street before his stitches heal." Marcus wrote it. A cold, neutral report. Not a lie, but not the truth. He told himself, "I didn't do it. I was just a witness." But after that night, he never slept as deeply. The image of that teenager haunted his dreams. Not the blood, but the question in his eyes, why? And Marcus had no answer. In the weeks that followed, Marcus kept working under Rick. He learned to dodge, learned not to ask questions when files were altered, learned to pretend not to notice when incidents happened in the interrogation room and the cameras suddenly lost signal. Rick always said, "This system has its own rules. You learn them or you get chewed up." And Marcus chose to learn not out of belief, but fear. But the cracks began to spread. A false narrative in this report, a missing video in that case, a mother screaming outside the station dismissed for disturbing the peace. They all clung like dust to the mirror Marcus once used to reflect his ideals. And one day he realized he didn't recognize the man in the reflection anymore. Rick still saw him as the good kid. Fellow officers would say, "You're lucky. Rick's got your back." But Marcus began to understand having someone's back isn't the same as protecting them. It felt more like a hook keeping him stuck in the mud. Every time he tried to stand up, it tugged harder, and part of him began to want that hook gone. Since the day Rick dragged Anne Hathaway out of the courtroom gallery, the Charleston Police Department could no longer maintain its false calm. Every hallway, every break room felt split by an invisible line. On one side, those who called an A diversity hire in a suit. On the other side, silence. Heavy silence, unclear if it meant support or waiting. Marcus Linwood belonged to the silent side, but that silence didn't help him sleep better. It only made the knocking inside himself louder each night. He saw Anne walk through the security gate every morning, head high, gaze steady, and he heard the filthy whispers behind her. They just hired her to boost the diversity numbers, or let's see how long she lasts. Someone slammed their hand on a desk once and said, "I'd rather be led by Rick than take orders from that black bitch." Marcus said nothing, but he clenched his coffee cup as if holding on to the last unroted part of himself. Then came the news. A new witness in the Elijah Porter case was coming forward. Marcus felt like he'd been pulled back to that file room 3 years ago, the day he handed Raleigh a recording without asking why. Back when Rick still called him my loyal gatekeeper. Now every headline, every face was a bell ringing in his ears. How many times have I stayed silent when I should have spoken up? He remembered every file he had date meditated, every document marked temporary and sent off without a trace. Marcus hadn't beaten anyone. He hadn't lied in reports, but he had opened the doors for others to erase the evidence. Back then, he called it duty. Now it was the reason he woke at 3:00 a.m., drenched in sweat with Elijah's name etched into the ceiling of his nightmares. He started backing things up quietly, discreetly. Each time he was assigned to organize documents, he took a few extra minutes to snap a photo, print a copy, or save a file to an encrypted USB. He stored them in his home desk drawer, the same one that used to hold his academy graduation photo. That photo now lay face down, replaced by forgotten records. For the first time in his life, Marcus considered betrayal. Not betrayal of the job, but of those who wore the same uniform and spat on its oath. He used to think, if I don't do anything wrong, I'm not guilty. Now he knew standing still is choosing a side. One night on duty, he saw a news clip of Anne proposing to reopen prematurely closed cases. He didn't take his eyes off the screen. Her face wasn't tense, wasn't rushed, just quietly dangerous to those who thrived in silence, relentless. And he knew if anyone could track every buried lead, it was the woman Rick had dragged out of court who still held her head high. A week later, returning to his office, Marcus opened his locker and pulled out his private folder. Every page matched a case Rick had touched. Every system log confirms edited timestamps and a copy of internal emails between Raleigh and a now disbanded oversight group. His hands trembled not from fear of being caught, but from a new awareness. For the first time, he wasn't anyone's gatekeeper anymore. That quiet weekend afternoon, the administrative wing of the Charleston Police Department was nearly empty. Rain had just stopped. The glass windows were fogged with lingering condensation. Anne Hathaway was still there, sitting at her desk in a mostly bare office. Everything was still new cold, but orderly like her. She was reviewing the statement from Elijah's mother when a knock came. 3 knocks, firm, deliberate. Marcus Linwood stepped in. His walk was steady, his eyes not quite confident. He placed a file on her desk. Not a USB, not a digital copy. Actual paper, printed hand-marked ink, still slightly smudged. Anne didn't say anything. She opened the first page. It was an internal email thread from 3 years ago between Rick Holston and 3 officers, including Philip Raleigh. The subject: quick resolution of the Elijah file, and a tidy instruction. Keep the log clean, no real name. The following pages showed system logs with identical patterns. Temporary disconnections right when reports were signed, not once, but twice more. both in cases involving black youths, and kept flipping her hand steady, but her eyes paused on one line. "If you want to stay out of trouble, clean it up, but don't leave blood on the yard." Rick's digital signature sent to Marcus in 2020. Marcus stood tall, eyes steady. "I'm not a hero," he said, voice rough. "I just don't want to be a coward anymore." The words dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Anne didn't reply right away. She looked at the file, then up at Marcus as if inspecting a new crack in concrete. "You know," she said slowly, "this could get you investigated, named as a co-conspirator, blacklisted." Marcus nodded, no hesitation. I stayed silent. I used to think I didn't hit anyone, so I'm not guilty. But now I know if I don't speak up, then I'm part of that kick too. His voice was low but firm. No grand speeches, just the final truth after too many sleepless nights. Anne leaned back in her chair. She didn't smile, didn't show gratitude like in the movies. But in her eyes there was a quiet acknowledgement, like she'd just seen a trickle of water seeping from solid rock. A sign that something deeper was beginning to fracture. "You kept a copy?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "One at home, one with someone I trust." "Good," Anne replied. "From now on, don't walk alone." Marcus smiled slightly. "For the first time, I don't feel alone." "Breathe them" was a pause not heavy, but like the quiet between two drum beats before the music changes key. For the first time, Marcus walked out of the room with his shoulders straight and chin up, no longer bowed like someone carrying shame for others, but like someone breathing new air into an old system. The kind of honest dialogue Rick Holston once told him had no place in this job. Marcus stepped into the hallway past a few officers sipping coffee. They looked at him. Some nodded, some stayed silent, but he didn't care anymore. In his heart, for the first time, he was standing on the right side of the line, not to go against his team, but to save what was still worth saving in this uniform, before it decayed completely. In that night, for the first time in years, Marcus Linwood slept not for long, but without the screaming in his dreams. Only one sound remained, the quiet rustle of paper in the hands of someone rewriting history from inside the very wall that once shielded lies. The Charleston afternoon turned cold. The fading light slipped through Anne Hathaway's office window like a gentle warning from the weather just before true darkness fell. She was reviewing an internal affairs report when a soft knock sounded. Not hurried, not timid, just 3 knocks, steady and firm. She opened the door. Standing before her was a tall man, dark-kinned, his gray coat worn at the cuffs, shoes dusted. He stood upright, eyes steady. "I'm Jalen Morris," he said. "I was there in the courtroom that day. I need to talk to you." Anne tilted her head slightly and nodded. "No questions." She let him in and closed the door. In the quiet room, Jalen chose not to sit. He stood by the window, eyes looking out, but his voice focused. "I was in the last row during the hearing. When Rick Holston dragged you out, I knew it was time I stopped hiding and didn't interrupt." Her eyes gave the signal, "Go on." Balan spoke. 7 years ago, he was a freelance air conditioner repairman working around the city. One late afternoon, just after finishing a job at a West Side apartment, Rick Holston blocked his car. No lights, no sirens. Rick demanded to search the vehicle, claiming an anonymous tip about drug trafficking. Jalen was stunned, but had nothing to hide. He let Rick check the trunk, and when Rick opened it, there were 2 small plastic bags, the kind used to package heroin, neatly placed between the toolboxes. "That wasn't mine," Jalen said, eyes still on the glass. But in that moment, I understood truth has no value if it doesn't fit the power held by the man with the gun. No surveillance cameras, no witnesses nearby. And the report that day, written by Rick himself, stated, "Subject appeared nervous, attempted to conceal item when asked to open trunk. Upon discovery of evidence, subject offered mild resistance and was subdued according to procedure. Signed, Rick Holston." The second signature came from a backup officer who coincidentally resigned within 3 months. Jalen was detained, then prosecuted within 6 weeks. No private lawyer. The public defender advised him to plead guilty for a lighter sentence, 2 years in prison. I accepted not because I was guilty, but because I was tired, Jalen said, voice calm to the point of haunting. Tired of trying to prove my innocence in a system that had judged me the second I walked into the courtroom. Only then did Anne speak. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Jalen turned back. His eyes held no rage, only the dull pain of an old scar brushed by a cold wind. I didn't know who I was up against. Rick was the hand, but I knew there were many more hands holding silence for him. If I spoke out, I'd be crushed. He paused, then continued, until I saw him drag you out of that courtroom in broad daylight under cameras and law, and still believed he'd never pay the price. That was the final drop. Not because Anne was chief of police, but because Rick dared to repeat the same crime in the very place where justice was supposed to live. And this time, he picked the wrong person. Jalen inhaled, pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. My detention receipt. He said, I've kept it for 7 years, not to remember, but to remind myself. I once had my voice stolen, and if there's a chance to get it back, I won't let it pass. And looked at him. No pity, no surprise, only respect. Are you willing to testify? She asked. Jalen nodded. I don't need to be believed. I just need to speak. And this time I won't speak from the dark. And sat before her computer screen, pale blue light casting across her tense face. Jalen Morris's file had just been reopened under her special access authority as chief of police. In the pile of aged documents, nothing stood out on the surface. A routine drug arrest defendant pleaded guilty, short sentence, no appeals, but that smoothness made her suspicious. Rick Holston never did anything routine. She combed through each entry. The arrest report listed the time as 5:45 p.m., August 14, 2017. But Rick's electronic time card logged his shift ending at 4:00 p.m. No overtime filed, no stay behind order. The checkpoint that day was marked inactive for maintenance. A note Anne had already seen in at least 4 other cases involving Rick. More suspiciously, the file contained only Rick's signature. No second officer, no photos. A random arrest with no camera, no witnesses, and no one inside the department asked a single question. Each detail clinked down like pieces of metal on a cold table, echoing, pointing toward a darker picture, and looked back at Jalen, who still sat quietly across from her, hands folded. She placed the file down. Are you still willing to testify? She asked. The room paused. Jalen didn't answer right away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tightly folded slip of paper, a yellowed, creased prison calendar, his first one after sentencing. I've kept this since that day, he said, voice flat, unshaken. Not to feed bitterness, but to remember I was once forced into silence. I keep it to remind myself not to forget. Now I want it to speak for me. Anne said nothing. She understood better than anyone the weight of buried memories that refused to die. People like Jalen squeezed and discarded by the system. When they rise, they don't need to scream. They carry bite marks, but they don't bleed. They speak little, but their words can't be erased. She looked at the paper. In a world of databases and digital records, such a slip might seem meaningless. But in the fight to reclaim justice, it was the last anchor keeping the truth from being swept away. You don't have to stand alone, Anne said. We're building enough to restart the entire investigation chain, and I want you at the front of it. Jalen nodded. As long as they listen, even just one. This time they won't be allowed to look away. Anne replied Jalen's presence on the witness list wouldn't just be another detail. It would be a living reminder of hundreds like him, branded as criminals to cover up systemic failures. And from here, Rick's case was no longer a crack in the concrete. It was the start of the wall's collapse. Jalen Morris was never the paranoid type. After the trial, he tried to keep his life simple. Evening shifts at an auto shop solo, dinners then home to his ground F floor or apartment in a rundown South Side building. But for 3 straight days, he noticed a gray SUV parked across the street. Same spot, same angle, no front plate. Every time he looked, the windows stayed up, and behind the glass sat the same man in a baseball cap hunched over, smoking in silence. He never got out, never drove off, just watched. Not a coincidence, a message. On the 4th night at 2:00 a.m., Jalen stepped outside. The SUV was still there. When he stared directly at it, the man stubbed out his cigarette and turned away. No direct threat, but the message was loud and clear. Someone wanted him to remember what it felt like to be watched, stalked just like the first time Rick Holston caught him. At the same time, inside the Charleston Police Department, an unmarked envelope arrived on Anne Hathaway's desk. No sender, no postmark. The receptionist shrugged, said it looked like admin paperwork, but when Anne tore it open, she found a single sheet inside. Bold letters printed clearly, "Walk away now, and there's still a way out." Beneath it was a photocopy of a 1994 case file, the fatal shooting of a black civilian on King Street. Victim Anthony Hathaway, her father, a file that had vanished years ago. Now it was in her hands with a red stamp slashed across the cover. Closed. Anne sat in silence. The wind outside whistled through the window frame like the sound of an old dream trying to return. She placed the file next to a photo of her mother, the woman who had stood before the courthouse with a blood-stained shirt but was never heard. Now the same hands. Those who thrive in shadows and wield fear like a tool were trying again. But Anne was no longer the 9-year-old child clinging to her mother in a crowd of silence. Meanwhile, in a dive bar north of the city, retired Lieutenant Wynn, an officer whose name came with more rumors than records, raised a glass with 2 men in short-sleeve suits, no badges. Wynn didn't need introductions. His voice was gravel worn down by decades of cigarettes and interrogation rooms. "If she digs deep, there won't be anything left to cover," he said. One of the men asked, "What about Rick?" Wynn waved dismissively. "He's reckless but loyal, and if this system wants to survive, we'd better remind dreamers of reform. There's no room for heroes on this road." News of Wynn's return spread like smoke. No one at the department said his name aloud, but everyone knew. When he was active, Rick was his jump boy, always protected. Files Rick handled bloody or buried never leaked for one reason. Wynn held the keys. Now, with Anne reopening old cases and witnesses like Jalen speaking up, Wynn could feel the cement he once poured into the department's foundation beginning to crack. And if those cracks spread, they'd drag down every secret a generation of officers had sworn to protect. But Anne wasn't backing down. She looked at the warning envelope and filed it under a new tab Clean Slate Initiative. She didn't call the press, didn't tweet. She simply typed one sentence to the Internal Affairs Lead Activate Witness Protection Protocol and check server access logs. Someone's trying to hide bloody hands with white gloves. An emergency meeting was called for 6:30. Amom the sun hadn't risen. Church bells hadn't chimed, but the 3rd floor of Charleston PD was lit up. Anne stood in front of the digital display, its glow stretching across her tense jawline. She didn't repeat what they all knew. "Someone's tampered with the files," she said flatly, her voice sharp as a blade. A young officer near the end of the table raised a hand. Last night there was a suspicious log. An internal admin account accessed the Elijah Porter case the exact moment you were reviewing the hard copy. Anne's eyes narrowed. "Which account?" The officer shook his head. Display name was Admin T. It's a shell account. Anonymous access only given to command-level roles like Raleigh used to have. A low murmur swept the room. That name still cast shadows on the old plaster walls. At that same hour, Jalen was taking out the trash after his shift when his phone rang. Unknown number. He picked up, expecting a water filter ad. But a deep male voice spoke with no intro, no emotion, just one line. "Remember your first time in juvie?" Then silence. No background noise, no static. Just a dead tone like a stone dropped in a dry well. Jalen gripped his phone and looked up. The gray SUV was gone, but the feeling that someone was behind him hadn't left. When Anne heard the report, she wasn't surprised. She didn't react with panic. She'd expected this. It was just a matter of when. Now it was clear. The rats buried beneath the rotting floorboards of the old system were starting to stir, and when cornered, they'd bite, not to win just because they had nothing left to lose. Anne didn't lash out. She knew that pounding fists and demanding answers would only send them deeper into hiding. She needed something else, something that made them feel the ground heating up under their feet. She ordered a full audit of server logs from the past 6 months, filtered by shell accounts, and manual verification of all IP addresses accessing the system after hours. But even that wouldn't be enough. That afternoon, Anne signed off on a contract with an independent legal team from Atlanta, the same group that led internal rights cases in Miami and Baltimore, where officers accused of abuse were finally taken to court. This team had no ties to Charleston, no stake in its politics, and most importantly, they specialized in protecting whistleblowers from their own institutions. Whispers started inside the department. Some said she was going too far. Others claimed she was tearing things down just to prove a point and didn't care. She wasn't here to be liked. She was here to smash the polished mask of order the old system had worn for too long, hiding rot and violence underneath. She knew to clean dried blood off the floor, you had to pry up the tiles at day's end, and stepped into the empty hallway and stared down toward the end where Arlie's old portrait still hung coated in dust. She paused a few feet away, didn't take it down, didn't smash it. Just looked as if saying, "I know you're still here, but this time so am I, and I'm not leaving." Charleston's afternoon sun cast a pale golden hue over the old oak trees, but the suburb where Philip Raleigh lived seemed untouched by time. His red brick house sat tucked behind a row of pines, the dark roof dulled by years. Every window shuttered tightly as if the light outside no longer deserved entry. The gate was unlocked, but the silence here wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence found in places that buried too many secrets and wanted no one to remember. Anne parked a little way off. No siren, no uniform. She walked slowly toward the house, briefly glancing at the bronze statue of a police officer by the steps. Etched beneath it, loyalty, integrity, justice. A familiar slogan. But in this stifling quiet, the words sounded like mockery. The door opened before she could knock a second time. Philip Raleigh stood there, older than in photos, shoulders slightly slumped, but his eyes still cold like recycled steel. "Chief Hathaway," he said, first voice steady like those press conferences of the past. "Didn't think you'd come in person." Anne nodded and stepped inside. "I thought a few questions might get answered faster face to face." The living room was lit by lamps with no natural light. Thick curtains sealed out the sun, and the yellowish glow shone on a glass cabinet filled with metals commendations and an old photo of Raleigh flanked by a tactical unit. Rick Holston was in it too, wearing a smug expression. In this room, time had stopped in an era where men like Raleigh were the law. They sat across a long wooden table. Between them, a glass of water and a distance that couldn't be measured in inches and didn't circle around. "I'm reviewing the case file for Elijah Porter. ID EJ45. There are irregularities." Raleigh leaned back, arms crossed. "Irregularities, or are you just looking for something to hang on to?" Sometimes the truth just isn't clean enough for daylight, and kept her tone even. That case was closed in 48 hours. No scene photos, no witness statements, and the final signature yours. But according to the system log, it was time-stamped at 214 a Wyming. She paused. pulled a copy of the signed document from her folder, and placed it on the table. "Do you usually work late nights alone, Mr. Raleigh?" Raleigh narrowed his eyes at the paper, not surprised, more like weighing whether to continue playing the role of the forgetful old man. Eventually, he chuckled lightly, voiced like a veteran recounting war stories. "You know how the system works. Truth isn't always the priority. Sometimes a case needs to disappear early to protect the bigger structure." "What structure?" Anne asked. "An officer's reputation. The illusion of stability in a so-called safe neighborhood, or the power of a group hiding in the shadows." Raleigh didn't respond right away. He stood, walked to the cabinet, and touched a medal engraved with an eagle. "You know, Hathaway, I once believed what we did was about justice. But justice is more fragile than you think. If everyone digs through the past just to find flaws, this whole system would collapse." And stood eyes sharp as blades. "Then maybe it should collapse, if what holds it up is a lie." At that moment, Raleigh no longer smiled. His face stiffened. His eyes lost their condescension, replaced by something closer to weariness. Not because she threatened him, but because he realized she had gone further than any of her predecessors, and there was no turning back now. Anne collected the folder, walking toward the door. "I didn't come to ask for permission," she said without turning. "I came to remind you the time of men hiding behind medals is over." As the door closed behind her, Raleigh remained in the weary glow of his home. For the first time, he saw his house, once a fortress of honor, as just a hollow shell, cold and stale. The air was still thick when Anne paused at the threshold. She didn't leave just yet, her back straight, her gaze piercing the darkness where Raleigh stood beside his trophy case. "Have you ever thought," she began, voice not raised but hard as forged iron, "about the people left behind after every one of your decisions?" Raleigh didn't turn. He remained facing the cabinet, fingers tracing the thin layer of dust on the glass. "You're talking about your father," he said, tone disturbingly casual. "Anthony Hathaway. I remember that case." Anne didn't confirm. Raleigh went on like telling a stranger's story. "Unfortunate incident. The officer involved was found to have acted in uncertain circumstances. No footage, no direct witnesses. Internal report closed in 10 days, and you gave the final stamp and cut in. My father had no weapon, no record, nothing but a grocery bag and a wallet, and he was shot on the sidewalk in front of his 9-year-old daughter, and your entire system reduced his death to a clerical error." Raleigh turned to face her for the first time since she entered. "You think you're changing the system?" he asked, not mocking, but almost genuinely curious. "You think a few internal reviews, a couple of witnesses, some TV headlines can erase what we built? This system survives because it knows it's dirty. No one wins without getting dirty." And stepped closer, her eyes freezing. "Not everyone needs to climb through blood to reach power." She paused, then said more slowly, "I don't need your confession. I don't need your cooperation. I didn't come to bargain, and I'm not here to appeal to your conscience. I came to warn you. The so-called solid wall you built is rotting from the inside, and I'm going to tear it down brick by brick." The room fell into a rare kind of silence, not out of caution, but because the truth had been spoken too clearly, too late. Raleigh didn't retort, didn't smirk. He just stood still. And in that moment, for the first time since retiring, he felt the house he lived in, the one bought with a clean pension from the top of the force, no longer felt sturdy enough to shelter him. Anne turned and walked out. The afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting a long shadow across her face, like a line that could no longer be crossed back over. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. Every step she took across that floor was already a verdict written in the same silence Raleigh once used to erase an entire generation of guilt. The door shut behind her. Raleigh remained behind the curtain, staring out. The wind stirred the fabric slightly, bringing in a chill he didn't recognize. He stepped back, then drew the curtain tight as if not seeing Anne would make the threat disappear. But he knew this was no longer about one woman with a personal vendetta. This was the first wave, and it wouldn't stop just because he chose to stand still. When the first clip was uploaded to TikTok, it had only a few dozen views. A 12-year-old girl, the daughter of social affairs reporter Camille Burns, had secretly used her mother's phone to record it from the back row of the courtroom. The video was unedited, with no filters, just 47 seconds long. But those 47 seconds changed everything. In the video, Rick Holston approaches a black woman sitting in the front row, his voice loud like a hammer striking steel. "You think this is a circus? Get up out now." Then he grabs her arm and yanks her from the seat like she were some kind of nuisance. The crowd stirs. A woman yells, "What the hell are you doing?" The screen shakes, then freezes, just as the judge slams the gavel. "Enough, stop right now." And then comes the bombshell, captured as clearly as if it were broadcast on stage. "May I introduce to the court Dr. Anne Hathaway, the new chief of police of this city." Within minutes of the girl uploading the clip to her mother's TikTok account, the video was picked up and reposted by a well-known freelance journalist on Twitter. In less than 2 hours, it went viral. From Charleston to New York, from legal forums to human rights communities, the video became a fuse the city couldn't ignore. Digital headlines exploded in unison. Officer drags police chief from courtroom. Woman accused of disruption is actually new department head. Charleston still haunted by the ghost of racism. Mayor Harold Wentworth, who had tried to stay neutral when Anne was appointed, was forced to speak up. Within 6 hours of the video spreading, an emergency press conference was held at City Hall. He stepped up to the podium, eyes sunken from a sleepless night, but had to state each word clearly. "We have seen the video, and the city of Charleston cannot, must not, and will not tolerate any abuse of power, regardless of who the person is or what title they hold." Camille Burns. The girl's mother and a respected investigative journalist couldn't hide her emotions when she learned the video came from her daughter's phone. She told me, "You couldn't speak up because you're a reporter." But I'm not. I'm just someone who saw something wrong and recorded it. That quote was later shared tens of thousands of times. People began calling the girl the witness without a badge, a witness without credentials who shook an entire police system. At the police chief's office, Anne received a call directly from the mayor. It wasn't an apology. It was to inform her that an interagency panel would be formed to investigate Rick Holston's actions and also review the closed case files with unclear closures. And this time, they couldn't pick insiders. The panel had to include an independent attorney, a community representative, and at least one federal official. "I hope you'll cooperate," Harold said. Anne answered calmly, "I don't need hope. I need the truth. And this time we're going to bring it into the light before any more blood is spilled." The top-floor conference room at the Charleston Police Department had never been this silent. Fluorescent lights aligned in perfect rows cast their cold glow onto a long table of dark mahogany. In each chair sat a face accustomed to power. Former chief inspectors, district commanders, heads of legal, and a few carefully selected internal reps. But this time there were no budget updates, no tech upgrade proposals. No one spoke before Anne Hathaway. She entered with no presentation, no aides, just a thick folder and a single whiteboard. Quietly, she wrote 3 words in bold strokes: "Mirror protruder." The handwriting was firm, unwavering. No frills, no room for misinterpretation. Anne scanned the room, not like a roll call, but like she was peeling off every mask in the room. "I'll keep this brief," she began. Mirror protocol is a full-spectrum internal audit. We're reviewing every case from the past 10 years. Those closed for lack of evidence, missing internal complaints, mismatched logs, everything. No exceptions. A chair scraped back. Officer Carver. South District Commander leaned back. "You declaring war on the department?" someone muttered. "And who gets to define what counts as wrongdoing?" "You." The room shifted instantly from stillness to resistance. Anne's expression didn't change. "I don't define it. The data does. Logs don't lie unless someone taught them how. That's what I'm after. A hand slapped the table. A former internal affairs officer, once Rye's ally, spoke up. This is a political trap. 10 years. No one in here is clean. Anne met his gaze, voice even and cold as ice. Then maybe they shouldn't be in this room. She didn't wait. From her folder, she pulled a printed diagram, bold lines connecting incidents. Elijah Porter, Jalen Morris. Lost logs, the shell account admin T appearing in 14 closed cases over 3 years. At the center, Rick Holston. Beside him, Philip Raleigh. She pinned a chart to the board, linking nodes in red like sketching the wiring of an underground system. Silence filled the room. The chart didn't need explaining. It spoke for itself, too clearly to deny. What you're doing will tear public trust apart, Officer Miller said gruffly, and turned slowly, approaching him. Trust isn't built on filthy walls. If the foundation is lies, tearing it down isn't destruction, it's correction. And a tense breath broke in the corner. Someone wiped their face. Someone else glanced away. Some couldn't look at the board anymore and tapped the board. Mirror protocol has no immunity. No one's exempt, not even me. But if you think I'm doing this for revenge, I'll ask just one question. If the person dragged out of that courthouse wasn't me, but your mother or your sister, would you still call it a problem? No answer. She circled the last line on the board. Launch begins next week. Then walked out. No one moved, not out of fear, but because for the first time in years, a mirror had been raised inside a room that had long been a fortress, and now no one stood outside its reflection. The meeting ended, but no one stood up right away. A heavy quiet lingered, not out of respect, but calculation choosing sides. Chairs creaked softly, but bodies stayed still. The mirror protocol chart remained like a crack running through everyone present. Each connection, each name, each timestamp accused without saying a word. Slowly, factions revealed themselves. No raised hands, no declarations, just glances exchanged, stares that dodged or challenged. The first group was the young, not many years in not much rank, but their eyes were clear and their fists clenched. They didn't say they supported her. They didn't need to. They stood, grabbed the documents Anne had passed out, and left without looking back. One woman in her 30s, formerly assigned to West Division, gave Anne a slight nod on her way out, a silent promise. The second group stayed put, grumbling, whispering, lighting cigarettes in the no-smoking room. One muttered, "She'll drag us all down for a few old files." Another scoffed, "She thinks he's Joan of Arc." Soon the poison spread. "This is mass suicide. The mayor will flip on her. You can't take down the system." Captain Reynolds' face flushed, shot up, and pointed at Anne. "You're burning every bridge we have." And didn't lift her eyes. Just replied, "Every word nailed into the table. I don't need a bridge if it leads straight to hell." Then there was the third group, the most dangerous, the silent. They said nothing, offered no support, just watched, waiting to see who fell first. These were the ones who always survived reform. Not by being right, but by being silent at the right time. Anne knew they'd never be allies, but she couldn't ignore them. Because when the winds shifted, they'd be the ones signing off on the final report, no matter who was left beneath the wheels. As Anne stood, the room hadn't fully emptied. One man suddenly walked away from the table. Lieutenant Holloway, 34 years on the force. He said nothing, just placed his badge on the table, spun it once in front of Anne, and left. The door closed. No applause. No one called him back. But another figurehead of internal IT reached into his jacket and handed Anne an envelope. No sender. Inside a single sheet. Header and bold. Access logs. June 2018. Case C4297B. At the bottom, a handwritten note. Some things are never lost, just buried. Anne took it without a word. She knew even in darkness some lights were quietly waiting to turn on. At that moment, a call buzzed in another officer's earpiece. It was from City Hall. The arrest order for Rick Holston had been approved. Charges abuse of power and obstruction of a federal investigation. The room didn't cheer. No celebration, but a soft breeze moved through the open window like the air just after a storm when the ground is still wet. Anne turned back to the whiteboard. She took the marker and drew one final circle around the mirror protocol diagram. Inside it, the tangled lines now connected held within a single cold outline. She said, voice low but steady enough to fill the room. From now on, no one stands outside the mirror. No one dared use the word internal the old way after that day, because from that day forward, internal meant truth. The detention room beneath the Charleston Police Department didn't smell of blood, but rye-reed of cold metal and worn-out memories. Rick Holston had walked past this place hundreds of times, even pointed towards Cell 3 and barked non-compliant attitude to throw someone in. But today, he was the one sitting there. Wrists that once wore luxury watches now bound by scratched steel cuffs. The door opened silently. Anne Hathaway entered. No lawyer, no camera crew, just her in a white shirt, dark blazer, and eyes that carried no vengeance, only one thing certainty. Rick looked up, lips curling into a smirk. Here for the big final face-off, I figured you let the press handle that part, and didn't respond. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him. Between them was a cold steel table polished like it had never been used. The air was thick. The flickering fluorescent light above blinked once as if to remind them that here, even light could be punishment. Rick leaned back, voice laced with disdain and faint satisfaction. You're not a cop. You're the product of a political stunt, a token with the right skin tone, and a name that plays well on TV. You were built for optics. Anne's gaze didn't flicker. Calmly, she placed a thick file on the table. No label. It didn't need one. Rick glanced at it, and for a split second, just a flicker. Something shifted in his eyes. He opened it page by page, peeling away the last layers of armor he had left. An internal report from 2018 on Elijah Porter bearing a signature confirmed to be forged. A series of shell accounts used to erase system logs after Philip Arley's and financial documents linking transfers directly to an account under Philip Relay's closest friend, Rick, froze. A vein in his neck twitched like a nerve he thought long dead had just been hit, but a second later he chuckled. A dry, hollow laugh without conviction. You think you can scare me, he said, but his voice had lost its edge. It sounded shorter, older, brittle, and didn't raise an eyebrow. She left the file untouched, neither pushing it forward nor taking it back. She just looked at him as if waiting for something in him to crack. An internal collapse, or at least the moment he realized the game had no next round. Rick gave a hollow laugh again, but his eyes now held disorganized defiance. Do you even know who I am? He asked, like a relic clinging to a lost identity. I saved fellow officers from gun runners in North Bridge. The old mayor shook my hand. And you've never done a patrol. Never responded to a real shooting scene. Yet you sit in the commander's chair because Anne cut in quietly, because you thought you were untouchable. Her voice was ice, and you were wrong. Rick pressed his lips together. He stared at the file as if willing it to disappear, but his hands remained still. Beneath the tanned skin of a so-called enforcer trembled something unspoken and rose. She didn't take the file. She left it behind, like a ticking device in an unlocked cell. Before turning away, she paused, speaking just loud enough. I don't need to threaten. I just need the truth. And this time it's not wearing a uniform to protect you. Then she walked out, leaving behind a man who once thought he was the law, now lit by the uncertain flicker of a worn-out ceiling lamp. Rick stared at the file resting on the table like an artifact pulled from the depths of somewhere he never wanted to revisit. The face once used to issuing judgments now looked displaced. He shifted, lowering his head slightly, just enough to avoid Anne's gaze. not enough to admit defeat. "You think," Rick rasped, no longer arrogant, "you're going to save this city's kids by exposing me?" He looked up, cracks visible in eyes once glazed with self-assurance. "There'll be more of them, and they'll turn into me. Starving, desperate kids clinging to a badge like it's a leaking pipe in a burning house. And they'll learn to survive with a boot to the face of the first boy too slow to raise his hands and didn't flinch." "I'm not here to save," she said, every word sharp as stone. "I'm here to end the cycle you were allowed to repeat." She stepped closer, fingertips resting lightly on the edge of the file but didn't flip it. "Elijah Porter, 16, broken collarbone. No footage exists, but now there's testimony from his mother and from the nurse who treated him." Rick looked at her. No denial, no confirmation, just silence. "Jalen Morris. 2 years in prison for drugs you found. Filing logs edited 3 times. No witnesses. And the date matches the weekend you claim to be out of town for a funeral." He swallowed. The reflex said more than any excuse could. And then the midnight system logs that vanished, always tied to a handful of trusted friends, all linked to shell accounts that led straight to Arlie's under-the-table compensation. Anne stood firm, her voice falling into a velvet tone, soft but fatal. "You think this is the final match, but it's the first time anyone's seeing the cracks. What you did wasn't just brutality. It was a curriculum, a warped training ground. And a younger generation was forced to survive in it, then taught to stay silent because that's just the rules." Rick shuddered slightly. His mouth moved like he wanted to protest, but instead there was only a long, low exhale, a sound Anne never expected to hear from someone like him. "I only did what they taught me the day I put this uniform on." His voice was no longer firm. It slipped out like a truth trapped in his throat for 25 years and didn't blink. "And I'm the generation that's going to teach it again from scratch." The silence in that cell wasn't the silence of agreement. It was the silence between 2 eras. One crumbling, the other rebuilding. One learned to hide blood behind medals. The other stared into it to redraw the map of justice. She stood slowly, no hurry, as if there was nothing left to flee from. The fluorescent light reflected off the now open file, its pages littered with names and figures raw and undeniable, waiting to be carved into a verdict. Rick didn't look at her anymore. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that once cuffed so many, now motionless, cold, and useless like rusted steel. As Anne reached the door, she turned once, her voice calm but sharp, like a tripwire finally triggered. "Next time you see flashing lights behind you, they won't be power, there'll be a mirror." And then she walked away, leaving the man who once believed himself a nail in the law, now silently watching himself melt in the warped reflection of what he once called justice. By the 3rd day after the mirror protocol was unveiled, Charleston was no longer a quiet southern city. It had become the eye of a national media storm. On the streets surrounding the police department, city hall, and the long overlooked neighborhoods, rows of white satellite vans crowded the sidewalks. Each one a mobile broadcast unit emblazoned with familiar names: CNN, MSNBC, NBC, and a rising force with millions of followers, Public Eye, an independent investigative network. Special segment titled "The Black Curtain, 10 Years of Buried Truth in Charleston" aired during prime time. Its host, veteran investigative journalist Ava Monroe, didn't need theatrics. She simply looked straight into the camera and said, "For over a decade, erased reports, tampered access logs, and victims turned into suspects built a system that seemed untouchable. But for the first time, someone dared to hold up a mirror to it." The screen cut to graphics. The Elijah Porter and Jalen Morris cases, connection maps of shell accounts, arrows pointing to Rick Holston and Philip Raleigh. Footage from the mere protocol session played with narration. Each revelation landed like a blow to the fragile self-confidence of law enforcement systems across the U.S., and the national audience was no longer silent. Within 24 hours, over 10,000 signatures were sent to the Department of Justice demanding a federal investigation in Charleston. The hashtag Mirror Protocol shot up to Twitter's top 3 trends alongside testimonials. I'm Elijah in a different state. Jalen's story is my little brother's. Someone hold a mirror up to my city, too. Governors from Illinois, California, and Massachusetts publicly announced they would audit all previously closed for lack of evidence cases within their police departments. A Harvard law professor said on national television, "This is no longer Charleston's story. This is a federal ethics test." And at the end of the broadcast, Ava Monroe stood in front of Charleston Police HQ, turned to the camera, and asked a question that made the entire country shudder. If this is Charleston, what we can still see how many other cities are hiding bodies under the floorboards. Even before the media firestorm cooled, Charleston itself was burning from within, not because the Mirror Protocol was wrong, but because it was right. So right, it kept people awake at night. Within 72 hours of the meeting, 3 mid-ranking officers submitted resignations citing misalignment with the department's new direction. 2 more were suspended after publicly declaring, "Mirror Protocol is a betrayal from within." What used to be murmured in break rooms became anonymous posts on conservative forums where Anne Hathaway was called a Soros-backed political operative, a plant sent to tear apart law enforcement from the inside. It wasn't just social media erupting. Anne's office mailbox filled with anonymous letters, one stating bluntly, "A single bullet could end Mirror Protocol faster than 10 years of paperwork." Her security detail urged tighter protection. The local Bureau of Security suggested GPS tracking and risk watch list enrollment and declined them all. During an unannounced, unpolished live interview on national TV, no hairstylists, no makeup, and looked straight into the lens and said plainly, "If I step back, the voiceless will never hear their names spoken in a room of justice. I'm not here to protect reputations. I'm here to finish the work left undone 30 years ago." The impact of that sentence spread faster than any lie ever could. Despite threats and smear campaigns, the image of a woman with no armor, no weapon, just a map of the truth and eyes that didn't blink became iconic. And then the real test arrived. The first town hall meeting since the Mirror Protocol was made public. The community hall on King Street was tightly secured but left open and refused to turn it into a fortress. I want them to walk in to see that they can't drown out the truth with volume. As expected, a protest group arrived holding signs and chanting, "Political pawns don't represent Charleston cops and Mirror Protocol equals no more police power." Tension escalated when some pushed into the hall, but before things could spiral, something no one predicted happened. 4 men, all former officers still young who once served under Rick but had resigned over shady incidents, stepped onto the stage. They stood shoulder to shoulder in front of Anne. No microphones, no speeches. Their presence said enough. Not all cops opposed the truth. Wearing the badge didn't mean embracing the lie. The effect spread like flame-catching light. One broadcast captured Anne standing in front of the Mirror Protocol board, not in a meeting room, but among the people presenting the chart to a hall full of residents. Her voice was clear and grounded. "How many of you were left behind by a report tonight? I'm here to listen." No one shouted anymore. No one denied it. When the light is strong enough, it doesn't just illuminate. It burns away the layers of dust used to blind justice. The studio lights didn't flicker. They shone steadily as if to confirm that this time no one would switch them off halfway through. Not like when he was dragged out of his car by Rick in silence. Not like when his name was entered into the system without an investigation. And definitely not like the day he left the courtroom with a 2-year sentence, while Rick walked away with another medal pinned to his chest. Today, Jalen Morris sat at the center of a stage with no dramatic set, no soaring music, just a chair, a silver microphone, and a black host who didn't interrupt, didn't edit, didn't steer the story. Please, the host said, start from the moment everything changed. Jalen sat upright. No tension, no rush. His voice wasn't booming like a public speaker's, but it carried the weight of someone whose voice had once been ripped from his throat. 7 years ago, I was driving home after a night shift. An officer named Rick Holston pulled me over for a broken brake light. 10 minutes later, he said he smelled drugs in the car. 20 minutes later, I was in handcuffs. He paused. Millions held their breath. Not because the story was shocking, but because it was too familiar. The only difference this time was that it was being broadcast. Jalen continued each beat, peeling back the thick scab of an old wound. He spoke of a precinct report of a court session that lasted only 40 minutes, of a lawyer who looked at him 3 times before saying, "Best to plead guilty. You'll get out faster." He spoke of 2 years behind bars where every morning he scratched a mark on the calendar taped to the wall, not to count time, but to remind himself, "I'm not crazy. I'm not guilty." When the host asked, "What made you decide to speak out?" Jalen didn't look at the camera. He looked into the audience at a young mother holding her child, at a boy in a baseball cap sitting beside his father. Then he said, "A woman once asked me, 'Are you willing to tell that story again?' She didn't promise to save me. She only promised to listen and to make the system listen too." On the screen was a single symbol mirror protocol, but no one had to explain it. The story spoke for itself. This time, the truth didn't need the mic turned up. It found its own voice. The audience didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They stood silent as if witnessing a swearing-in ceremony. And that atmosphere through the television waves spread into living rooms, gas stations, and late-night diners across America where people were relearning how to listen to themselves. When Jalen finished, it wasn't with a call to action, but with a sentence so soft it broke the air. "I'm not the only one. I'm just the first one they turned the mic on for." The host, known for sharp, no-holds-barred debates, took off his earpiece. His eyes were red. His voice cracked in his breath. "I didn't just hear one man's story. I heard the echo of an entire generation erased from the records." In the days following Jalen Morris's appearance, Anne Hathaway's office was no longer a place of quiet footsteps and neatly scheduled meetings. Instead, it buzzed with paper letters, urgent emails, and phone calls that rang like fire alarms at midnight. "There's another testimony," her assistant said, placing down the 17th envelope that day. This one from a prison in Missouri. Anne opened each letter by hand. She didn't let anyone pre-screen them. The pages were scribbled in school paper typed with worn-out typewriters, some only a single line written in blue ink. I was there. I saw. I was too scared to speak. Now I can. Each letter was a fragment of truth once buried. One spoke of a father beaten and holding for disturbing the peace. Another from a prison medic described being called to treat a young man who fell, yet had a boot print still visible on his chest. One was from a woman who signed only L. She said Rick had threatened her after she witnessed a late-night beating. He told me to shut my mouth if I wanted my daughter to keep going to school. One letter made Anne reread it twice. It came from a former internal affairs officer. "I once signed off on a false report. I was ordered to. I knew I was part of a rotting machine. I haven't slept well in years. If you're still collecting evidence, I want to make it right." On Anne's desk, the mirror protocol board lit up with red dots. Each dot a witness, a new lead, a truth that had once been buried. But the most terrifying part wasn't the number of testimonies. It was how consistent they were. All referred to a list of easy targets. An unofficial classification system from Rick's operation. People of color, low income with minor prior, no clear family support. All marked. They weren't called by name, just labeled as targets. You froze at a fax with a single sentence. If he could do it to me, he could do it to anyone. Below it, no name, just 3 numbers. C31 and 8, a case number deleted from the system 6 years ago. That night, after everyone had left the precinct and remained at her desk, the room glowed softly under the amber light of a desk lamp surrounded by letters, files, and red-stamped pages. On the mirror protocol board, she marked the 100th red dot. Each dot was a testimony, a voice, a moment, the system stayed silent. She stared at the board as if looking into a mirror, not just reflecting the crimes, but the decades-long complicity behind them. Anne whispered, not needing anyone to hear, like a message sent straight to Rick and those who shielded him. "We are no longer afraid, but this time you will be." At first, it was just a small post on an obscure blog, an anonymous account, no profile picture, smug and cryptic in tone. Does the current leader truly deserve their position? Does anyone still remember the scandal at Howard University in 2003? A single line, but posted as if it carried a curse. 6 hours later, a local tabloid site ran a clickbait headline: "New police chief suspended for cheating in college." Accompanying it was a blurry snapshot of an academic record of dubious origin stamped in bright red, "Confidential leaked." Within 24 hours, online opposition groups had turned the post into a frenzy. Comments like, "Knew it, she's not clean," and "Cheaters don't get to clean house" spread like a virus. Wynne was behind it all. Not directly, not by name, but Anne knew because of the writing style, the way public opinion was manipulated, the recurring pattern in every post sowing doubt without evidence, creating small cracks and public trust, then letting fear do the rest. Anne sat in front of her laptop, clicking through each link. She wasn't angry, just silent. Her face appeared in several photoshopped images. Her eyes turned demon red, her face grotesquely distorted. Classic tactics dehumanized the target to make the attack easier for the crowd to swallow. But what Wynne hadn't foreseen was that the world had changed. Less than 12 hours after the first article appeared, a group of independent investigative journalists, those who had followed the Mirror Protocol closely, jumped in. They traced the original IP, discovering the first account that posted the leak was a fake bot operating from an address linked to a media company that had once subcontracted for Raleigh's former security unit. A rapid investigative piece was published. Smear campaign against Police Chief Anne Hathaway. Who's behind the fake news? It broke down the entire dissemination chain, posting Times affiliated accounts, and most damningly, someone who accidentally shared it far too early. W's former assistant. On social media, the tide turned almost instantly. The hashtag #StandWithAnne began appearing alongside posts featuring Anne standing before the Mirror Protocol board. People who had remained silent started sharing personal stories. One black student wrote, "I was once a target of Rick. If it weren't for a woman who believed me back then, I might not still be in school. Today, I stand with her." A former internal employee posted a photo of an anonymous warning letter they'd received when trying to report Rick, captioned, "They once scared me. Not anymore." A whole movement emerged, not just in defense of Anne, but in defense of the right to speak the truth. In Anne's office, the lights stayed on well past midnight. Her assistant entered and placed a printed copy of the investigation series on her desk. "You'll want to read this." Anne flipped through a few pages, her eyes landing on one line. "When the wicked can no longer control fear, they'll control rumors." She said nothing, just smiled. Not a proud smile, not a defensive one. It was the smile of someone who knew the old poison had lost its effect, and the ones who spread it were trembling because they had nothing left to lose and didn't retaliate. No press conference, no televised rebuttals to each false accusation. She understood one thing. If you stop to kick at every dog that barks, you'll never reach your destination. So she kept walking straight ahead through the muddy swamp of public opinion with the steps of someone carrying the weight of truth. During the first week after the fake news erupted, Anne focused entirely on her duty. At the precinct, she summoned 3 new witnesses. One of them was a former data analyst who had been internally reassigned by Raleigh after raising concerns about deleted logs. Anne also ordered the tech team to recover all internal access logs from the past 3 years, including overwritten or deleted records. On the 9th day following the media assault, a community meeting was held at the Charleston Cultural Center. No banners, no slogans, no rallying call, but hundreds showed up. Elders sat next to teens in hoodies. Mothers who once knocked on police doors looking for their sons now sat upright, their eyes shining like those who had just stepped out of the shadows. They didn't come because Anne called them. They came because they too had once been silenced. On stage, Anne didn't mention any articles, didn't speak of when or the accusations. She simply asked, "How many here have a story they never dared tell because they feared no one would believe them?" Over 40 hands went up. No one talked about the fake news because no one needed to care anymore. Everyone understood. It was just an old trick and they were immune. That evening at the office, an unmarked envelope was left at the door. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten letter. The sender, a former member of W's media team, someone who had helped craft the disinformation strategy. The letter read, "I once worked in the shadows, but after watching Jalen's interview on TV, I realized I no longer have a reason to stay silent. This is every media strategy Win planned to use to take you down. Every step, every plan, every target, and didn't need to say a word." She forwarded the entire USB content to the legal team and immediately filed an official complaint to the Department of Justice (DOJ), accusing the opposition group of deliberately manipulating public opinion, sabotaging the credibility of a public servant, and interfering with a state-level internal investigation. 3 days later, at another town hall meeting, this time broadcast live, and stood directly in front of the camera. Behind her was the mirror protocol board, and in front the audience filled every square meter. She used no script, no teleprompter, just the voice of someone who knew she was standing on a front line where there was no room for missteps. "I know what you want. You want me to fight back, to react like a cornered politician? But I'm not a politician. I'm the daughter of a man who was shot dead because of his skin color. I'm the police chief of this city, and I know exactly what systemic poison smells like." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the faces. "When poison no longer works, the one who spread it will have to drink it." No one applauded. No one chanted slogans, but someone cried. Someone placed a hand on a stranger's shoulder, and an entire city, once drowning in fear, felt for the first time what it was like to no longer be ruled by fear, but by something stronger. The truth, which doesn't need miracles to exist. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it. The Charleston courthouse that morning felt different. There was no murmur of conversation, no board tapping from the court clerk, just thick, still air and harsh white light beaming down on the witness stand. Like the room itself was preparing for a surgical excavation of memory. Rick Holston was escorted in through a side door. No medals, no badge, no sunglasses or title. Just a man with a squared jaw, bloodshot eyes, and shackled wrists creaking between two federal agents. He scanned the courtroom, still trying to clutch the remnants of old power, but no one returned his gaze, only silence. Anne Hathaway sat in the front row, not in uniform, but in a muted charcoal suit. She didn't need to speak, didn't need a microphone. She was there to listen and to witness. This wasn't an ordinary trial. It was the moment long silenced voices would break through like the first cracks in a rotten wall of authority. Jalen Morris was called first. He walked up holding a wrinkled sheet of paper. No one knew what it was until he raised it. The intake schedule from his first time in juvenile detention, a physical reminder of being made into a criminal by the man sitting now. Head lowered. Jalen's voice wasn't loud. It was low hoarse RO, but carried the weight of anger wrapped tight for years. I never heard my own voice in that courtroom. All I heard was the sound of the cell door closing behind me. No one interrupted, no soundtrack played, just the truth and the heaviness it brought. Next came Marcus Linwood. His uniform still looked fresh, but something in his face was aged. Remorse. I thought I wasn't guilty because I never laid a hand on anyone. He locked eyes with Rick. But I watched. I knew. And I chose silence. He paused, then said what few in the system ever admit. Silence is complicity. Then Geneva Porter, Elijah's mother. She walked slowly carrying a copy of her son's handwritten statement, the one Rick and Raleigh buried behind doctored system logs. She didn't look at Rick. Her eyes passed through him toward the ceiling like she was speaking to someone no longer here. "He didn't just beat my son," she said. "He taught a whole generation that justice was a scam, and my child was the offering they fed that lie." The words ripped through the last curtain shielding the courtroom. Rick began to sweat. His hand slid across the bench trying to steady himself, but it slipped on the leather. No more smug grin. No more sharp stares. Just a man unraveling in real time. Outside, someone began live streaming. Inside, the witnesses kept coming. Each one another stone laid on the path to truth. No interruptions, no chuckles. No one feared power anymore. They'd learned to speak, and this time no one could silence them. The air inside felt thick as guns. The old wooden benches creaked with each new testimony. The storm of truth wasn't over. It had only just begun. An older officer came, next, gray-haired shoulders still bearing the impression of long years in uniform. He had served under Rick for 9 years. His voice wasn't bitter or soft. It was the voice of someone who had seen too much and stayed quiet for too long. "We were given verbal orders, never in writing. Rick once said, 'It's easier to pick up poor black kids. The data is on our side. Just make the arrest and the system will come up with the reason.'" The room didn't gap. It froze not from shock, but recognition. Then came a tech specialist, a woman of Asian descent in her 30s. She presented an internal system log from the Charleston PD. In it, a clear entry showed Rick Holston had accessed the data system on the night file. EJ-45 mysteriously disappeared. The login used was Rick's, but he wasn't on shift that night, and the device used was an unregistered internal terminal. She looked up. "I'm not a cop. I didn't know Elijah, but I know data doesn't lie." Rick tried to hold his composure. He sneered, muttered, "This is political theater lies." But the words fell flat like a stone dropped into a dry well. No one echoed him. The unraveling began in earnest when a video played. An old break room recording 3 years prior. Rick speaking to Marcus Linwood. "Just wipe the log. Those things only make trouble. We're the ones doing the work. Who's going to bother checking logs?" The volume was low, but each word struck like a bullet through the armor Rick had clung to. He went still. No more protests. No more spin. His jaw clenched, sweat forming at his temples. His eyes darted, searching for an ally. A nod, any sign of solidarity, none came. The judge didn't issue a verdict that day, but he ruled that Rick remain in federal custody with no bail, citing risk of evidence tampering and witness intimidation. When the ruling landed, Rick's legs wobbled. He gripped the bench knuckles white as if trying to snap it in half. Security moved closer, anticipating a reaction, but Rick only bowed his head, speechless. Anne said nothing. She stood, took one step forward, not to threaten, but like placing the period at the end of a long, silent indictment. When their eyes met, Rick didn't see the woman once dragged from the courtroom. He saw a mirror reflecting every choice he had made. Every lie he'd told, not distorted, not blurred a living verdict. Outside wind picked up on the courthouse steps. The crowd packed close, watching the live stream as Rick was let out. Cameras flashed, but no one cheered. Only a wave of silence rolled through the crowd like a tide. It was the silence of a city done listening to lies, finally learning how to hear the voices it had long ignored. He stood before the cameras, a face once etched into public memory, but now stripped of its badge, its smug smirk, its press conference polish. Rick Holston, the man who had styled himself as the last bulwark of order, now stood with his head bowed, hair disheveled, eyes dull from a sleepless night, not out of guilt, but because he had nothing left to hold on to. As the microphone was lifted to his lips, Rick looked up. Lips trembling slightly, though no one mistook it for emotion, he began, I was just a product of the system. I only did what I was taught. I never meant to hurt anyone." His voice crackled over the PA system, but each word wry of insincerity like a script penned by a soulless legal advisor. No one interrupted him, but no one nodded either. Reporters didn't scribble notes. Cameras didn't zoom in. The crowd didn't murmur. The silence was not awe. It was contempt. Rick wiped his face. No tears came. Only a trembling hand failing to manage an audience that no longer played along. The stage where he once performed power was now nothing but a cold stone pedestal built for a man who wore authority like armor but never truly learned how to bow. Behind him, rows of officers who once worked alongside him stayed rooted. No one stepped forward. No pats on the back. No one called his name. They stood like stone statues, faces colder than the January air. Some turned their backs. Others walked out of frame. Every look, even from former allies, recoiled, as if afraid to catch the shame that couldn't be washed away with tears. A child in the crowd tugged at his father's sleeve and asked, "Is he crying for real?" The father leaned down and whispered, "He's crying because he got caught, not because he did wrong." A small sentence, but it spread like a spark in dry woods. Rick covered his face, but his hands couldn't hide the truth, because the truth had already been laid bare in Jalen's testimony, in a grieving mother's tears, in Marcus's stare, and in the steel silence of Anne Hathaway. He had nothing left, except the illusion that if he looked broken enough, the world might offer him an honorable exit. No one came forward. No forgiveness was uttered. No hand was extended. Because some tears come too late, not as repentance, but as the last reflex of a man who only ever lived behind a mask. And today that mask fell on its own. Inside the Charleston Police Department, no one yelled, no one argued, but the air was thick, like a room where someone had pulled a grenade pin but hadn't let go. Officers who once called themselves the pillars, who laughed in private meetings when reports were handled internally, now sat upright, stiff, like students caught off guard. A list was posted on the bulletin board. Internal Investigation List Phase 1. No red lines, no notes, no explanations. But everyone knew if your name was there, your badge was no longer a shield for your conscience. An aging lieutenant, former deputy leader of the tactical unit, submitted retirement papers by late morning. No farewell party. No one asked why. Another officer, face pale, simply removed his name tag and walked out. No one stopped him, because they knew years spent living in the gray had left marks deeper than any report could show. And now those bowed heads, even without protests or indictments, weighed heavier than any formal charge, because this silence couldn't be excused. Anne didn't need to enter every room. She didn't need to pound fists on desks or slam files shut. Instead, she chose something simpler. A framed TPTX hung in the main hallway. On the left, Elijah Porter, age 16, eyes still wide from the day he was arrested. On the right, Jalen Morris holding his faded prison calendar. And in the center, her father, the man gunned down for standing in the wrong place with the wrong skin. 3 photos, no caption, no slogan. But every step past it, every officer who glanced up was forced to swallow a truth they had once looked away from. A young recruit new to the force whispered to a colleague, "That wall, it hits harder than any training video I've seen." No one replied, but the eyes of those who overheard for the first time did not look away. For the first time, they really saw. Not because they were told to. Change didn't arrive with fanfare. It came when the once silent stopped applauding the wrong, when bowed heads, once survival tactics, were stripped bare as complicity, and when justice stopped being a word in a report and became a set of photographs on a wall everyone had to walk past day after day without the luxury of forgetting footage from the special hearing replayed quickly across national media. No flashy edits, no background music, just raw faces and unfiltered voices, no longer held back, on screen. Rick Holston, once the face of hardline authority in Charleston, slouched, face buried in his hands. No more shouting, no more swaggering boots echoing through halls. Just the curled posture of a man realizing maybe for the first time the badge that once shielded him had rotted through, and behind it there was nothing left worth defending. TV stations added a simple subtitle beneath his image. When power is exposed, truth needs no weapon. The word spread faster than any political op-ed. They hit a collective nerve. The long-suppressed frustration of a public watching injustice happen, helpless to stop it. On social media, Rick's image became memes poster satire that needed no explanation. A 9-second video him wiping his face and struggling to look up was overlaid with the caption, "This is the face of fear with no one left to hide behind." One comment racked up over 500,000 likes. He's not crying because he regrets it. He's crying because for the first time, no one's coming to save him. But the impact didn't stay online. Across the city, community forums sprang up in churches, libraries, corner cafes. Not organized by the government, but by the people. People who once stayed silent now stood up to tell their stories. About being pulled over for no reason. About a nephew who was arrested, then released without a word. About a complaint that never got answered. An elderly woman holding a microphone with trembling hands said through tears, "I've waited 40 years for this moment, not for revenge, but to believe that justice is real." At a high school on the west side, teachers played clips from the hearing as part of civics class. Not to lecture about right and wrong, but to show silence is also a choice. One student wrote in her essay, "I don't know what Chief Anne Hathaway is like in real life, but I know that if something unfair happens to me tomorrow, someone like her will stand up." Lines like that without a single PR campaign were enough to crack the gloss the system had used to cover its rot. Because in the end, power doesn't collapse overnight. It peels away bit by bit when light reaches the places it thought no one would dare look into. And once people have seen, they never close their eyes again. And Hathaway didn't come to speak like a politician. She came as someone prying open the lid of a mass grave long ignored by the very people who had the power and duty to unearth it. She held no speech. She simply stepped onto the stage, gave a quiet nod, and motioned for the screen behind her to begin. The first slide appeared with one simple line. 27 cases closed without valid justification. Then, one by one, names began to appear. Marcellus Green, 14 years old. Traumatic brain injury after arrest in 2015, ruled accidental fall. Lisa Tron, Asian woman, injured after mistaken identity in a raid. No video evidence available. Malik Dawson shot while fleeing with an unknown object later confirmed to be a soda can. And more. Each name another incision in the public's idea of what justice is supposed to mean. No one in the hall said a word. Reporters stopped writing. Some looked down. A young woman in the corner wiped her eyes. The data kept rolling. Each entry with case number, denial timestamp, and the reason listed for not investigating. Often lack of evidence not sufficient for prosecution, or worse, no reason at all, just marked closed in internal notes and made no comments. She let the facts speak when the screen stopped on the final case. A teenager named Devontae Marks, who disappeared after being summoned to the precinct for preliminary questioning with no confirmation since of life or death. Anne stepped up to the mic. Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't harsh. These aren't forgotten cases. These are stories that were deliberately erased. And today, we're opening them all back up. She announced the official launch of the Citizen Inquiry Portal, an online platform developed by an independent task force in collaboration with civil rights legal organizations. On it, anyone could access decoded mirror protocol files, submit additional evidence, offer testimony, or share their own story if they had ever been ignored, dismissed, or threatened into silence. Justice cannot be reserved for those qualified to speak. Anne said, it must open its doors to those pushed to the margins. Then she stepped away from the podium. No conclusion needed. The impact of the press conference was immediate. Within the first 6 hours, the system received over 300 submissions from across the country. Some from Charleston, some from other states, some from prison, each one detailed. Some even included documents never seen by the public before. A 68-year-old man submitted an audio recording of his own case from 1984. A woman described a sexual assault by an officer that was never officially recorded. A former officer stated he was once asked to alter a report. He refused and was transferred soon after. By the end of the day, when the system paused to process the flood of data, the final tally on the dashboard read 624 people submitted information. 41 formally offered to testify. Not a huge number compared to Charleston's population, but enough to show the ice buried beneath the surface for years had started to crack. And when a man once wearing the badge stands in court, head bowed before the cameras, the system is no longer turning from within, it's being turned inside out. In the light of the post-quake days, Charleston was no longer just a city. It became a mirror reflecting the conscience of an entire nation. After the Mirror Protocol was released and received overwhelming public support, a domino effect began spreading across the American South. Within 2 weeks, delegations from Atlanta, Baltimore, and Houston officially contacted Ann's office requesting access to Charleston's internal oversight model and transparent data protocol. In Atlanta, a special inspection task force was urgently formed to review closed cases from the past 10 years. They found at least 14 files labeled insufficient evidence that had in reality never been investigated. Baltimore fared no better. One veteran officer was suspended after the Mirror Protocol resurfaced a 2015 incident involving the baseless arrest of a young black man. In Houston, a newly appointed young female police chief declared on live TV, "If Charleston had the courage to face its scars, then there's no reason for us to hide from ours." The NJCR Civil Rights Organization, alongside minority communities and legal advocates, launched a nationwide summit titled, "We Re-Examine Ourselves," a space where victims' former officers and justice representatives spoke not to assign blame, but to ask why silence had once been seen as the safest option. Some of Charleston's witnesses were invited to speak, including Marcus Linwood and Elijah's mother. Their words greeted with applause so long it left the room breathless. Anne Hathaway was invited to speak at a special session of Congress. Her speech lasted only 10 minutes, but reached millions through national broadcast. "Justice doesn't begin with well-written statutes," she said. "It begins the moment we dare to look into the darkest parts of ourselves and choose not to turn away." The session's close brought a moment no script could have planned. A member of Congress pulled a handwritten letter from his coat pocket, sent by an 8-year-old girl from Ohio. His voice trembled as he read aloud, "I never trusted police, but I saw you on TV. You made me want to believe again." As Anne stepped out of Congress that afternoon, dozens of reporters waited. But she didn't speak. She simply smiled, not burning with pride, not basking in victory, but with the quiet fulfillment of a promise kept. Somewhere, a child had just learned to believe again in something a whole generation had abandoned. Faith in justice. One October morning, as the first chill swept through the fallen oak leaves surrounding Charleston's judicial district, a piece of news made the city hold its breath. From the U.S. Attorney's Office came the announcement. The 1995 shooting incident involving Mr. Harold Hathaway will be reopened under investigation for civil rights violations and evidence suppression. One sentence yet, the result of 3 decades of struggle and 3 months of Mirror Protocol in motion, and was in her office when the news aired. She didn't rise. She didn't exhale in relief. She simply stared at the screen where her father's face appeared in an old archive clip. A kind smile, a sun-aged white shirt, and eyes that had never truly been allowed to close in peace. The document surfaced through a joint investigation between Mirror Protocol and the Federal Inspection Team. A retired officer in Arizona who had worked in Charleston in 1995 submitted a report, never seen in any official file, a handwritten statement revealing that the officer who shot Harold Hathaway had altered the time and location of the incident to avoid liability. At the bottom of the statement, a red pen had crossed out the line, "Suspect was unarmed," and replaced it with a typed phrase, "Subject displayed suspicious behavior." When Anne held that folder in her hands, she didn't cry, but her body felt pulled 30 years back to the door of the corner store, where a 9-year-old girl once waited for her father, to the blood-stained sidewalk, to the silent crowd, and to her mother's eyes. At a small memorial held at the Community Justice Center, relatives, old neighbors, and Anne's new colleagues stood in a circle around a portrait of Harold Hathaway placed for the first time in the very place that had once erased his name. A candle was lit. There were no long speeches, only one sentence from Anne standing inside the home where her father had once taught her to read. Darkness doesn't vanish on its own, but when enough of us stand up, it can no longer hide anyone. The light from the street lamp angled through the dusty window, reflecting against the photo frame. In that moment, no one spoke of the mirror protocol or the investigation. They simply stood there, as if finally the man had been seen. No longer a crossed-out footnote, no longer an incident handled, but a person, a father, a citizen, and a piece of history, once buried, now uncovered. The sky over Charleston that day was a pale gray, not rainy, yet not quite sunny either. Along the narrow path leading into the city cemetery, Anne Hathaway walked slowly. No entourage followed, no cameras, no witnesses. She didn't need any. Some moments are meant only for the living and the dead, and this was one of them. Green grass blanketed the weathered headstones, but the one she came for still shone despite the storms and the passage of countless seasons. Elijah Hathaway, silent but unyielding. 6 words, a name, a message, a life, and stood still for a long time, saying nothing. A breeze stirred the hem of her coat. In her hand was a black and white photograph. Her father in 1986, dressed in a white shirt, eyes smiling gently but holding firm resolve. The man who had taught her to read the law before she even understood what the law meant. The man who once told her justice is something you must demand, not something they will give. And then, one summer afternoon when she was 9, that same man was shot dead on the street by a police officer who she later learned had also been handled internally, just like Rick Holston. The report at the time claimed the subject acted in a threatening manner, but her father carried nothing more than a grocery bag and a wallet. She sat beside the headstone, gently placing the photo at its base. "I did it, Dad." Her voice was soft but steady, not trembling, not choked, just simple, like a greeting, a promise fulfilled. Over the past 30 years, there were hundreds of moments when she had wanted to stop, to forget, to give up. But every time she saw her mother's eyes, eyes that had lost a husband and nearly all faith in justice. And she knew if she didn't rise, another child on another street corner would lose a father, the same way, and there would be another gravestone bearing the same excuse. He pulled from her pocket a small cloth-wrapped item, a piece of an old shirt still stained with a rusty red patch of dried blood. Her mother had kept it for 30 years. A silent testament. Anne laid it beside the photo, then nodded gently. "I couldn't be at your trial, but you made it to mine." She smiled. Not a smile of triumph, but one that had waited 3 decades to form. Not searing, not smud, but sharp, like a blade honed by time. In the distance, the church bell tolled once. A dry leaf landed on her shoulder. Anne rose, adjusted her collar, and bowed one final time. "Your name will no longer be erased from the record. It will be the first chapter of a new system where silence is no longer a death sentence." The wind picked up as she walked away, but it didn't shake her. Each step was a beat that closed one chapter and opened a new era where the name Hathaway was no longer just a memory, but a warning. Some ghosts once stayed silent, but once their name, the entire system must answer. A special hearing of the Federal Oversight Committee was held in the Capitol, but the name that echoed most through the chamber was Charleston. And seated at the witness table that day, none other than Philip Raleigh. Once the most powerful supervisor in Charleston, Raleigh had retired with dozens of commendations, a spotless public record, and a Medal of Honor presented by the state's governor. But today, he wasn't behind a podium inspiring crowds. He was under questioning, facing a series of allegations, abuse of power, document tampering, and complicity in at least 31 cover-ups of internal misconduct, including the death of Elijah Hathaway. OAE sat upright, still holding on to the posture of old authority. But around him, no legal team, no advisors, just a microphone, a glass of water, and dozens of eyes watching. The chair of the committee read aloud, "You signed off on 47 internal cases closed due to lack of evidence, 18 of which are now confirmed to involve falsified reports or coerced testimonies." Raleigh didn't deny, just silence. Another committee member held up a system log printout clearly showing admin time, login time 2:14 a.m. Proof that Raleigh had accessed and manipulated internal files well after his shift supposedly ended at 6:00 p.m. Why would a man who signed out hours earlier appear in the system over 8 hours later? Again, silence. But this wasn't the silence of power anymore. It was the sound of the first crack breaking through a once impenetrable wall. Anne Hathaway sat in the public gallery. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Raleigh, who once stood far above her in the ranks, was now trembling slightly at the corners of his hands. Once the face of Law and Order on magazine covers Reige's name now lit up the screen next to a chart exposing the protection system he built. Rick Holston's shell accounts, tampered logs, all the pieces laid bare. The room wasn't just seeing a man fall. They were watching an entire structure collapse. Then came the recordings. First, the voice of Elijah's mother. Shaky but clear. "If Philip Raleigh hadn't signed off on that file, my son might have seen justice, but he chose to protect the system, not the truth." Then Marcus Linwood. "He didn't teach us to uphold the law. He taught us to shield each other as long as it kept us employed." And finally, Jalen Morris. "I went to jail because of a fake report. He approved it without asking a single question. He knew, and he didn't care." At last, Raleigh spoke, his voice dry somewhere between defiance and confession. "I did what the system needed so it wouldn't collapse." But a committee member cut in. "The system you describe, it exists to serve people, not to bury them." That sentence landed like the final blow against the wall Raleigh had spent 20 years building. When the hearing ended, a formal recommendation was issued. Launch a federal criminal investigation into Philip Raleigh and begin prosecution proceedings against all individuals linked to the abuse network. Mirror Protocol was no longer an internal initiative. It became the first federal standard in U.S. history to audit local law enforcement power structures. As Anne exited the Capitol, she didn't speak to the press, but she paused briefly in front of a plaque that read, "Freedom is not a gift, it's a commitment." She knew she couldn't erase the past, but she had made sure it could no longer be hidden. More importantly, those who once thought they were alone in standing up to power now knew the truth might take time, but it never gets lost. The Charleston City Hall chamber was filled to capacity. From citizens who once marched in protest on the streets, to young officers now wearing their new uniforms under a pledge of transparent accountability, all were present. In the front row sat Marcus Linwood, Elijah's mother, Jalen Morris, and many others whose testimony had forced a system to bow. There was no noise, no whispering, only silence. Not the kind born of fear, but of expectation, and stepped up to the podium. No speech in hand, no PowerPoint, no theme music. A soft light fell across her face. No longer the woman once dragged from court, once dismissed, once threatened, but someone who had looked into the roots of a sickness and refused to turn away. She looked across the chamber, meeting every gaze. She nodded once to each, then she spoke one sentence clear and steady without need for amplification. "We are not here for revenge. We are here to stop what should never have been allowed." No applause followed. None was needed. A long silence stretched in its place solemn, like a sacred rite. Because everyone in the room understood. Her words weren't a boast. They marked an ending and a beginning. The screen slowly faded to black. A single line appeared. White text on a dark backdrop based on too many true stories. Final cut. The front gate of the Charleston Police Department, a place once distorted by history, now bears a new brass plaque deeply etched with the words, "No one is above the law. No one is left behind." And inside, a department restructured, purged, slowly realigned under transparency. Not perfect, but for the first time watched over by the very people who were once shut out. The lesson and the message. The story of Anne Hathaway isn't just about a black woman reclaiming justice for her family. It's a powerful reminder. Never rush to judge someone based on their skin color, background, or past. Rick Holston once saw Anne as someone who didn't belong in the front row, never realizing she would one day lead the entire system. Talent, integrity, and resilience don't need to shout to be seen. They shine in their own quiet, undeniable way. But every biased glance could be a person carrying a vision. And behind every silence, a storm might be gathering, one ready to shift an entire era. This story proves justice can be delayed, but it never loses its voice. Those once pushed outside the system, when given a chance, often become the very force that reforms it. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't understand you? Have you ever been overlooked only to quietly prove you were far more capable than they imagined? If this story made you think, share it. Don't let injustice repeat itself under the cover of silence. And if you want to keep hearing stories that challenge, inspire, and restore faith, subscribe. We've got many more true stories to... She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to press charges. She simply stood, looked him in the eye, and introduced herself. "I'm your new chief." And just like that, the badge on his chest shrank under the weight of his own ignorance. Because leadership doesn't always arrive in a power suit or a loud command. Sometimes it walks in quietly, knowing exactly what it's worth. Let this be more than a story. Let it be a reminder. Respect isn't earned by fear, and power isn't proven through force. It's shown when you rise above, especially when you have every reason not to. If this story made you feel something, don't scroll past. Like this video, so more people hear stories that the news won't tell. Comment below. Should he be fired on the spot, or given a second chance under her leadership? And subscribe to Soulful Stories 4, where truth meets courage and dignity always has the final word. Because in a world that still judges by appearance, we will keep telling stories that remind you who people really are beneath the uniform.